I remember the day my brother, Ethan, gathered the family in my parents' living room with a trembling voice and watery eyes. He was a naturally charismatic individual, the sort of person who always seemed to have a compelling story up his sleeve. But that afternoon, there was a desperate edge to him that made me sit up straight. He explained he had been having unusual pains and dizzy spells for months, but he'd brushed it off, thinking he was just stressed. Eventually, he confessed he'd gone to the doctor. At first, he stammered he had received the horrifying news that he had a rare form of liver cancer. The moment he said the word cancer, the room fell silent. My mother gasped, my father turned pale, and a thick wave of shock rose in my chest as I watched Ethan wipe away tears. He stuttered that he'd waited so long to tell us because he couldn't accept it himself. He said the prognosis was grim, but there was a chance of survival if he underwent an extremely expensive surgery. Then he hung his head in shame, telling us he couldn't afford it without help. Not from insurance, not from anything. And that's when the trembling began in his voice, trembling that I took as fear, but I would later realize it was guilt. My immediate reaction was heartbreak. Ethan and I used to be inseparable as kids. We spent our summers building forts in the backyard, sneaking out late to catch fireflies, and making pacts that we'd always be there for each other. Even after we grew up and life took us in different directions, I became a high school math teacher, and he pursued a series of odd jobs that ranged from being a gym trainer to a car salesman. I never doubted that he cared for me. He had that magnetism that could instantly put me at ease. So in that moment, when he told us about his alleged cancer, all I wanted to do was stand by him. I thought about the pain he must have felt carrying this burden alone. My parents, equally devastated, rushed to hold him, to comfort him, to promise him they would do everything in their power to save him. We believed him without question. We didn't ask for medical reports or a second opinion. We didn't question the severity of the condition or wonder why the insurance wouldn't cover something so crucial. We were too caught up in the sense of panic, sadness, and immediate fear of losing him. The fundraising started right away. Ethan, ever the showman, posted on social media about his diagnosis. He wrote long emotional posts describing his condition and how he was coming to terms with the fear of dying young. He included tear-jerking photos, always with a hat pulled low over his eyes, looking sickly and pale, except that there was a slight ring of theatricality to it. At the time, I couldn't see it. I was blinded by concern, and I was proud of him for being so open. I thought it must be hard to share such vulnerability with the world. Donations poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. My high school chipped in with a small fundraiser. People offered supportive messages, prayers, and encouragement. My parents drained their savings to contribute to his medical fund. I offered all I could from my own modest account, though I was never as financially well off as I would have liked. Ethan assured me any small amount would help. He wept gratitude every time he received a new donation, putting on a performance of trembling lips and clenched fists that radiated despair. Each moment felt more desperate than the last, and we all fed right into it. I was so busy worrying about him that I didn't realize how little he let us in. He never allowed me or my parents to accompany him to his appointments. He'd make excuses, saying the doctor's office had strict COVID protocols, or that he was rushing from work, or that the schedule changed last minute. Sometimes he said he just couldn't bear the thought of us seeing him hooked up to machines or looking weak. I respected his boundaries, trusting he was protecting us from the worst of it. But there were odd clues that might have tipped me off if I'd been less emotional. He didn't lose any weight, despite claiming his appetite had vanished. He never showed any hair loss or signs of chemotherapy. He never had medication around, not even the mild stuff used to alleviate side effects. But whenever I pressed him, he'd say something like, "It's experimental. I can't talk about it." Or, "I'm trying to stay positive. Don't make me revisit the worst details." So I always backed off. I didn't want to add to his misery or appear intrusive. In retrospect, it's amazing how readily we ignore inconsistencies when we want to believe someone we love. The first real crack in the facade came during a family dinner, about a month after his big announcement. Ethan arrived late, looking disheveled, claiming he had just come from another consultation. My father asked him which hospital he'd visited this time, and Ethan muttered the name of a facility on the other side of town. My mother, determined to show her support, said she wanted to stop by that hospital to leave some homemade soup next time he went. Immediately, Ethan grew defensive, telling her it wasn't allowed, that there were policies against visitors in the oncology ward. My father, who had quietly been doing some research, frowned and said he'd read that hospital had lifted many of its restrictions. Ethan backpedaled, fumbling for an explanation. In that moment, I felt an uneasy chill, but I pushed it aside. I told myself the stress was getting to him. He was probably tired of explaining every detail to worried family members. But later, as I replayed the scene in my head, I couldn't ignore the flicker of panic in his eyes. It didn't match the sorrow or hopelessness of a terminal patient. It was the panic of someone who might be caught. A few weeks later, Ethan claimed he needed a sudden trip to another city for a specialist appointment. He said his doctors had collaborated with a renowned surgeon who required an in-person examination. By that point, the community had raised a substantial sum for his alleged treatment. Although we never had a precise tally, I suspected it was well over $50,000. My parents were drained both financially and emotionally. They had considered selling their car and taking out a second mortgage if it came to that. Everyone was so worried about Ethan's health that no one bothered to question the logistics of his trip. Except I couldn't shake my growing suspicion. I asked him if I could drive him to the airport or at least drop by his apartment the morning he planned to leave, but he insisted he had a friend handling everything. He wouldn't say who this friend was. The day after he left, I called every hospital in the city he claimed to be visiting, using a vague explanation that I needed to check on my siblings' well-being. No hospital had a record of him. The pit in my stomach hardened into something cold and furious. When Ethan returned a week later, he was all smiles. He claimed the consultation had gone well and that he was now on a waiting list for a life-saving operation. I recall standing in my parents' living room, watching him spin this tall tale about the futuristic facility he'd visited. He spoke about advanced technologies, robotic arms that performed precision cuts, and a team of doctors who had apparently never encountered a tumor quite like his. My mother was in tears of relief. My father clapped Ethan on the shoulder and said he was proud that Ethan was fighting so bravely. I just stared. I couldn't decide whether to cry or scream. I wanted to believe him, but my earlier phone calls told me otherwise. Yet, I didn't say anything in that moment. Maybe I was afraid of the fallout, of the heartbreak it would cause my parents if I confronted Ethan openly. Maybe I was still in partial denial. I felt stuck in a web of emotions, torn between loyalty to my family and an increasingly urgent sense that we were all being conned. So I waited, planning to dig deeper on my own before unleashing the truth. My next move was to track down any paper trail. Ethan had never shown us an actual medical bill or prescription, always hand-waving that he would receive them digitally and forward them later. He never did. I decided to drop by his apartment unannounced one morning, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would confirm or deny my suspicions. When I arrived, I found his apartment in its usual state, messy, with clothes strewn everywhere, half-empty takeout boxes on the coffee table, and gaming equipment scattered around. Nothing about it said terminally ill patient. I opened a few random drawers in the kitchen while he was in the shower, searching for medications or hospital documents, but I found none. Instead, I stumbled upon receipts for expensive electronics, new sneakers, and a hefty down payment for a fancy new motorcycle. My heart pounded as I flipped through them, each purchase more extravagant than the last. I heard the water shut off, and I scrambled to put everything back. When Ethan came out, I lied and said I had dropped by just to see how he was feeling. He grinned and offered me coffee, not suspecting a thing. My suspicions had blossomed into certainty. From that day onward, I decided I would not let him keep spinning his deceitful story. Yet, I was meticulous. I needed proof. The biggest problem was that my parents were already so emotionally invested that a mere accusation from me wouldn't convince them. They would think I was mistaken, perhaps projecting my frustration or overreacting to a misunderstood detail. So I chose to gather irrefutable evidence. I quietly began reaching out to a private investigator I found through a friend of a friend. I explained the situation. My brother was claiming to have a terminal illness, raising money from everyone, and refusing to show any real documentation. I wanted the investigator to follow Ethan's financial transactions if possible, and to see where he went during his so-called treatment sessions. It cost me a chunk of my savings, but I was done letting him exploit our family. I also confided in only one friend, Serena, who had always been level-headed. She offered to help me follow Ethan if needed, to take photos or gather statements from neighbors. We plotted discreetly, determined not to let Ethan suspect a thing until we had a mountain of evidence to confront him with. Over the next few weeks, the investigator fed me tidbits of information. Ethan had no record of hospital visits matching his claims. Instead, he was frequently seen at upscale bars, nightclubs, and shopping centers. He'd purchased a high-end gaming computer and placed a deposit on a sports car, though he hadn't told anyone in the family about that yet. In one instance, he even rented a beach house under a false name for a weekend getaway with a group of friends. The money we believed was going toward life-saving medical treatment was fueling his lavish escapades. Meanwhile, my parents were skipping their own medical checkups because they couldn't afford them anymore. My father had a bad knee that needed surgery, but he was putting it off, convinced that every penny counted for Ethan's survival. My mother had canceled her annual mammogram, claiming she'd reschedule once they were in a better financial position. Watching them sacrifice themselves for a son who was lying through his teeth lit a fire in me. I seethed with anger, but I kept it hidden behind a veneer of concern. I wanted Ethan to remain clueless until I had the perfect moment to confront him. As the evidence piled up, so did Ethan's audacity. He began hosting online fundraisers, broadcasting live videos where he'd speak softly about his condition, occasionally pretending to cough or struggle for breath. Each time he did, donations from kind-hearted strangers spiked. Some of my colleagues, seeing me as a worried sibling, contributed whatever they could. At school, students even organized a bake sale to support Mr. Carter's brother. Every day, I stared at my phone, reading the investigators' updates about Ethan's nightlife escapades, while also receiving messages of sympathy from people who had no clue he was a fraud. My stomach churned with rage and disgust. At times, I wanted to blow the whistle immediately, post the screenshots, the videos of him dancing at clubs, the receipts for his expensive toys. But then I'd imagine my parents' faces. They would be crushed, humiliated in front of everyone they knew. And I realized a public scandal might overshadow the real issue. Ethan needed to face serious consequences, not just embarrassment. So I bided my time, working with the investigator to build a case that would be impossible for him to explain away. I was determined to let the hammer fall hard. Eventually, the investigator compiled a file thick with bank statements, surveillance photos, and screenshots of Ethan's own social media activity under various pseudonyms. He was bragging to certain friends about the money he was raking in. He called it his genius hustle, laughing about how gullible people were. The final straw was a short video clip the investigator obtained, Ethan at a nightclub, popping a bottle of champagne and boasting loudly, "Here's to a life free of worries." The timestamp matched a date he'd claimed to be in the hospital for a chemotherapy session. My blood boiled when I saw it. The day had come for me to act. I arranged a family meeting at my parents' home, telling them it was crucial we discuss Ethan's treatment plan and finances so we could figure out the next steps. Ethan showed up, looking a bit wary, but still confident. My parents were anxious, expecting to finalize some plan to possibly refinance their home. In the living room, I set my phone to record and calmly took out the investigator's file. At first, Ethan wore his usual expression of feigned sorrow, but as I flipped through pages and photos, he began to tremble. My parents were confused, demanding explanations from me, from Ethan, anyone who could clarify the bizarre evidence they were seeing. I showed them the bank statements that revealed large deposits from crowdfunding sites, money flowing into Ethan's account almost daily. I showed them screenshots of him partying when he was supposed to be hospitalized. I played the nightclub video for them, forcing them to confront the horrifying possibility that their son might be a con artist. My mother broke down in tears, while my father's face turned ashen. Ethan tried to stammer some excuse, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that the video was old, that the bank statements weren't accurate, but he couldn't keep his lies straight. Finally, he broke down, admitting he wasn't sick. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, asking him how he could do this to us, to all the people who had opened their hearts and wallets. My father just stared at the floor, silent, his lips pressed into a thin, trembling line. I stood there, feeling equal parts vindication and heartbreak. I hated seeing my parents in such distress. But I also felt relief that the truth was finally in the open. Ethan's eyes darted around like a trapped animal, searching for a way out that didn't exist. That's when he started begging for forgiveness, his voice raw and frantic. He insisted he never meant for things to get so big, that it began as a small lie, and then it spiraled out of control. He claimed he planned to return the money eventually, that he was just waiting for a big investment to pay off. My parents looked at him with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief, still trying to reconcile the son they loved with the manipulative stranger standing before them. My father finally asked, in a voice that quavered with anger, "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Ethan fell to his knees, tears streaming down his cheeks, begging for another chance. It was a pathetic sight, but I felt no sympathy left in me. I thought about my parents' sacrifices, the late-night tears, the crippling anxiety, the phone calls I'd endured from teachers and students who were moved by his story. I thought about the donors who'd given money they didn't have to spare, and then I thought about how Ethan had been blowing it on luxuries. Something in me turned ice cold. I told him this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. There would be consequences. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cold and final. Ethan froze, his eyes widening in terror. My parents gasped, but neither told me to stop. I dialed right then, explaining that I had evidence of fraud against my brother. There was no forgiveness, no mercy. He had betrayed every shred of trust we had. I watched him get handcuffed in my parents' driveway, screaming for me to reconsider, but I felt only grim satisfaction. I hoped he understood the weight of his lies. My parents turned away, tears streaking their cheeks. I stood tall, clutching that file of evidence like a shield. I would never forget the look on his face as they took him away. He had hoped for pity, but all I had left to give was righteous retribution. No one would ever pity him again, least of all me. And I regretted nothing. From the day I turned 16, I knew how important it was to have financial independence. My parents had always been cautious with money, but not in a way that felt protective or instructive. It was more that they believed every penny needed to serve a purpose they deemed worthy. Of course, back then, I assumed they simply wanted what was best for me and my younger brother, Jacob. When I started working part-time at the grocery store in town, I was excited to finally earn my own income. Even if it was just bagging produce or mopping floors, I felt proud. At the end of each shift, I'd stash a small portion of my pay away in a savings account, hoping it would someday help me start a business or pay for college. I loved the thrill of seeing the account balance creep up every time I deposited a new check. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Since my parents didn't have a lot of extra cash, I understood that I couldn't expect them to finance my future dreams. I'd have to do it on my own. That sense of self-reliance fueled me as I navigated teenage life, anticipating the day I'd become fully independent. I wanted to believe that, despite our struggles, my family and I were on the same team. Little did I know, behind that facade lay the seeds of betrayal that would shape my future in ways I could never have predicted. I had no clue then how fiercely money could drive a wedge between the people who were supposed to protect me unconditionally. Life was simpler, or so I thought, until that blind trust in my parents' fairness was shattered by their choices that favored Jacob at my expense, forever altering everything. My parents' financial priorities shifted dramatically when Jacob dropped out of college after just one semester. He came back home complaining that school wasn't for him and he needed time to find himself. Unlike me, Jacob never had a consistent job. He preferred side gigs and quick cash, rarely sticking to one role long enough to collect a full paycheck. My parents coddled him, reasoning that he'd eventually hit his stride. They said he was just misunderstood, a free spirit who couldn't be confined by conventional expectations. I took that at face value initially, but over time it became clear that their patience with him was endless, while mine was wearing thin. By the time I graduated high school, I'd been working for almost 2 years, steadily saving every spare dollar. My plan was to attend a local community college, keep working part-time, and move into a small apartment with my best friend Gina. She was also determined to break free from an overcrowded household. We found a modest place we could afford if we pooled our resources. I was excited to begin this new chapter, hopeful that my parents would at least respect my independence even if they didn't understand it. In hindsight, that was naive. The first sign of trouble came when I tried to access my savings account shortly before my 18th birthday. I'd gone to the bank intending to withdraw some funds for the apartment security deposit. That's when I discovered something was seriously wrong. The balance was far lower than it should have been. At first, I thought it must be a clerical error. My stomach churned as the teller explained that there had been multiple withdrawals made by my parents. Confusion turned to dread because this account was supposed to be mine alone. Furious. That single word only scratches the surface of how I felt. When I confronted my parents, they didn't even try to deny it. Instead, they acted like it was no big deal. They insisted they'd intended to borrow the money but hadn't gotten around to telling me because, in their eyes, it wasn't urgent. My father shrugged and said they'd needed the cash to help Jacob pay off some credit card debt. According to him, Jacob had fallen on hard times after trying to launch a streaming channel that hadn't panned out. My mother chimed in that it was for the good of the family, and I shouldn't be so selfish about it. Selfish. That word was a punch in the gut. I had spent years working crummy jobs, saving meticulously, just so I could improve my own life, and apparently that was selfish. My anger flared, but I also felt a deep hurt. These were my parents, the people I'd grown up trusting. It seemed they'd decided that Jacob's comfort mattered more than my entire future. In that moment, I realized that the respect I craved from them might never come. Something inside me shifted. I was done playing the role of the obedient daughter who never rocked the boat. Sure, I couldn't just abandon them overnight, but I knew I'd never look at them the same way again. This was the start of a fracture that would only deepen over time. Jacob, for his part, didn't seem remotely guilty about my sacrifice. He mumbled an apology that rang hollow. To him, it was just money that came from our parents, as though I'd had no hand in earning it. My frustration turned into something darker, a simmering resolve that one day they'd all regret treating me this way. It wasn't practical to storm out of the house that same day. I didn't have enough to cover a security deposit anymore, let alone first month's rent. Gina could only do so much by herself. We decided to postpone moving until I could replenish some of what was taken from me. Meanwhile, my parents promised they'd pay me back when they could. That vague promise was their way of avoiding accountability. The truth was, they had every intention of continuing to support Jacob at my expense. Over the following months, I noticed little signs of their ongoing favoritism. I'd come home to find takeout boxes from expensive restaurants in the kitchen, and they'd mention how Jacob just needed a treat to cheer him up. They'd buy him pricey gadgets under the guise of helping him get back on his feet. All the while, I was expected to chip in for groceries, do chores, and keep my mouth shut. Each time I brought up the missing money, my parents claimed they were working on repaying me, but other emergencies kept coming up. Those emergencies always revolved around Jacob, who seemed blissfully unburdened by guilt. My resentment festered, but I channeled it into careful planning rather than open confrontation. I took extra shifts at the store, setting aside whatever I could in a new account under just my name. This time, I made sure my parents had no access to it. I kept a low profile, smiling politely while inwardly seething. Gradually, I rebuilt my savings, determined to cut ties the moment I had enough. My 18th birthday came and went without any real celebration, a reminder that I was on my own here. But that quiet anger propelled me forward, fueling my resolve for the day I'd finally walk out forever. That day arrived sooner than even I expected. 6 months after the initial theft, I'd saved enough to move into a tiny studio apartment across town. Gina had found a better deal elsewhere, so I ended up going solo, which suited me fine. I didn't tell my parents until the day I left. When I broke the news, they acted stunned, as if I'd betrayed them. My father insisted he would pay me back soon, that I didn't have to move out so abruptly. My mother pleaded with me not to abandon my family responsibilities, saying Jacob still needed guidance. Their crocodile tears meant nothing to me by then. I loaded my belongings into my old beat-up car and drove off without a backward glance. Once I settled in my cramped new space, it felt like I'd finally taken a step toward reclaiming my life. The relief was immediate, though a part of me still ached with the realization that my parents might never see me the way I wanted them to. Yet, the bitterness inside me wouldn't let me forgive them. They had stolen from me, chosen Jacob's comfort over my future, and shown zero remorse. I devoted myself to school and work, adopting an almost robotic routine. Weekdays were spent juggling classes and shifts at the store, weekends were for studying and extra hours. The meager pay was enough to keep me afloat, and I continued saving systematically. Every time I saw Jacob flaunt a new gadget on social media, I'd remind myself that I'd made the right choice by leaving. The more distance I put between us, the more I recognized I didn't need their approval. Still, I couldn't shake the anger. It lingered at the edges of my thoughts, waiting for a chance to ignite anew. I'd been living independently for nearly a year when I ran into my uncle at the supermarket. He was my father's older brother, a stern man who rarely interfered in family drama. But that day, he pulled me aside, concern etched on his face. He asked me how I was doing and if I needed anything. Unsure of his motives, I gave a non-committal shrug, but he pressed on, eventually revealing he'd heard about the money situation. My father had approached him for a loan after I'd left home, claiming they were short on funds because of my sudden departure. I almost laughed at the audacity. Uncle Frank looked genuinely concerned, though, and said he wanted to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of. It felt strange to have anyone in my family show real worry about me. I told him a simplified version of events, leaving out the venom that boiled inside me. He nodded gravely and offered to help if I ever needed it. Before we parted, he mentioned that my father and mother were fighting more these days, mostly over money. Apparently, supporting Jacob's aimless pursuits was draining their finances. The guilt card they'd used on me wasn't working on Uncle Frank, who refused to lend them anything because he suspected they'd never pay it back. Driving home, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation, that little spark of satisfaction flaring up inside me. They were finally facing consequences for their choices. I didn't pity them. I felt vindicated. Part of me still longed for a reckoning that would force them to confront the reality of what they'd done. I had no intention of reconciling or offering forgiveness. I wanted them to truly regret ever dismissing my worth. I just wasn't sure how to make that happen. The opportunity presented itself quite unexpectedly. I was working at the grocery store one evening when Gina, who still worked there, rushed over with wide eyes. She told me she'd just seen Jacob in the parking lot, looking disheveled and upset. Curiosity got the better of me, so I stepped outside during my break, half expecting some melodramatic scene. Instead, I found him slumped against his car, fiddling with his phone. He didn't notice me at first. When he finally looked up, he seemed more embarrassed than anything. I asked if he was okay, feeling a grudging sympathy despite everything that had happened. He mumbled something about being locked out of his latest side gig. Apparently, the streaming service he tried to rejoin had banned him for some violation. On top of that, he'd maxed out his credit cards again, and our parents were refusing to bail him out anymore. A flicker of shock crossed my face. "They won't help you?" I asked, trying not to sound gleeful. He shook his head, muttering that they'd run out of patience and money. Jacob was on the verge of losing his car, his phone, everything. The same brother who once saw me as a walking ATM now looked desperate and lost. A surge of resentment and satisfaction warred inside me. "Maybe you should get a real job," I said, unable to hide my bitterness. He avoided my gaze. "Yeah, I know I screwed up," he admitted, "but I thought they'd always have my back. Now they're saying they're tapped out." I studied him for a moment, recalling all the times I'd sacrificed so he could freeload. This was exactly what I'd warned them about. I took a pleasure in his misery. Yet I also saw an opening, a way to my revenge. Over the next few weeks, I fed Jacob little tidbits of advice, dangling the possibility that I might help him land a decent job. He lapped it up. I had contacts through the grocery chain's regional manager, and there was talk of an entry-level corporate position that required minimal experience. Jacob perked up at that idea. I played the dutiful sister, guiding him through the application process, polishing his resume, and coaching him on interview etiquette. On the surface, it looked like I'd turned into the supportive sibling I'd never been. Privately, I let my resentment fester, hoping I'd find a chance to twist the knife. I hadn't forgotten my parents either. Their finances were in disarray, and I had heard through the grapevine that my father was teetering on the edge of job loss due to layoffs at his company. My mother had taken on extra shifts at a local diner, but it barely covered their mortgage. Watching them scramble felt like cosmic justice. Yet, I still wanted more than their hardship. I wanted them to understand that their betrayal had shaped me into someone capable of turning the tables. When Jacob got called for an interview, I volunteered to drive him there. He looked nervous, appreciative even. During the drive, he confided that he felt guilty about everything that happened between us. I kept my face neutral, offering a vague reassurance that the past was the past. But inside, I was bracing myself to see if he'd actually grown or just wanted another bailout. At the interview, I waited in the lobby, pretending to be engrossed in a magazine. When Jacob emerged, he seemed optimistic. He thanked me for helping him. I smiled, quietly absorbing the irony. Jacob would learn soon enough that I'd arranged a different outcome entirely. It turned out my contact in the company's HR department owed me a favor after I helped her brother secure a position at the store. She was grateful enough to let me slip in a few quiet suggestions regarding Jacob's application. I didn't have her do anything outright illegal, just plant a seed of doubt about his reliability. He hadn't been entirely honest about his past work history, and a quick background check would show he'd been fired from a previous job for repeated absences. That was enough to raise red flags. Predictably, he didn't get the position. When Jacob called me with the news, his voice trembled with frustration. He said they'd claimed to find inconsistencies in his resume and questioned his commitment. I feigned surprise, telling him to keep trying. Inside, I felt a grim satisfaction. It was a small taste of the helplessness he'd inflicted on me when my savings vanished. Meanwhile, word got around that my father had indeed lost his job. I heard from my uncle that they were behind on mortgage payments now. As much as I relished the thought of them squirming, I wasn't fully satisfied yet. I'd carried that wound for too long to let it scar over without one final blow. My chance came when they reached out to me, practically begging for a loan. My phone buzzed late one night, and for the first time in nearly a year, my mother left a tearful voicemail explaining they were at risk of losing the house. She apologized in tones for having hurt me, promising they would pay back every cent if I'd just give them a help. A part of me was tempted to throw their desperation back in their faces, to laugh and tell them this was their just desserts. But revenge doesn't always look like slamming a door in someone's face. Sometimes it's letting them see how well you're doing without them and then refusing to rescue them from the mess they've made. So I arranged a meeting at a local cafe. My parents arrived looking gaunt and haggard. Jacob trailed behind, eyes downcast. They launched into their sob story, detailing the bills they couldn't pay, the collector's calls, the looming foreclosure. When they finally finished, I leaned back in my chair, calm and unflinching. "I remember when I asked you not to steal my money for Jacob's debts," I said, "and you called me selfish." My father opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. My mother gripped the edge of the table, tears brimming. Jacob looked away, shame shadowing his features. I waited a beat. Then I told them I'd give them exactly what they once gave me: betrayal. Calmly, I announced that I wouldn't lend them a dime, nor would I forget how they threw me under the bus for Jacob's sake. I stood up, placed a few bills on the table for my coffee, and walked out without another word. The foreclosure went through a few months later, forcing them to move into a cramped rental. Jacob eventually found a low-paying warehouse job. I heard through the family grapevine that life for them was difficult and humbling. Meanwhile, I continued taking classes, working diligently, and building my future one paycheck at a time. When relatives asked why I wouldn't help, I calmly explained they'd stolen from me once, and I had no interest in repeating that mistake. Some called me cold-hearted, but I refused to care anymore. My self-respect mattered more than their opinion. In the end, that was the victory, knowing I'd walked away free. I was 32 when I learned that the two people I trusted most had betrayed me. Lisa and I had been married for 7 years, and my best friend Tim was practically family. We'd grown up together, gone to the same college, and worked at the same firm for a time. We'd shared countless memories, laughter, and inside jokes that no one else understood. When I introduced him to Lisa, he embraced her like a sister, or so I thought. It was never in my wildest dreams that this bond could twist into something that would shatter my entire reality. I discovered the affair in the most cliché way possible, by checking her phone. Lisa had been acting distant for a few weeks, but I rationalized it away. Maybe she was stressed, or she needed some space. My suspicions rose one night when she left her phone unguarded on the kitchen counter. It vibrated multiple times, and I glanced at the screen. Tim's name popped up. At first, I just felt mildly curious, but then I read the messages and felt my chest tighten. What had once been innocent friendship had become something more intimate, more brutal in its betrayal. The words were explicit, leaving no room for doubt. She called him babe, and he called her my love. My mind froze. How long had this been going on? I scrolled back, seeing weeks of messages sprinkled with flirtation, confession, and plans to meet at places I thought were ours. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out, but I kept reading. My entire world was collapsing, yet I couldn't look away. Everything I'd believed in, our marriage, our friendship, was a lie. And with every message, my anger and hurt intensified, turning my stomach into unstoppable knots. I confronted Lisa immediately. I didn't wait for an explanation because I already had the evidence. She cried, denying nothing, which felt worse than if she had tried to lie. Tim was nowhere to be found that night, so I drove around yelling into the empty car, rehearsing all the things I wanted to say to him. My rage was beyond anything I'd ever felt. By the time I got home, Lisa was sobbing on our living room couch, phone still in her hand. I couldn't even look at her. Everything was broken, and I didn't know what to do. Tim called me 2 days later, sounding nervous. He stammered through some half-baked apology about how it just happened, and he never meant to hurt me. Hearing his voice made my blood boil. I demanded he meet me in person. He agreed, probably out of guilt or fear. When we faced each other, I saw a broken man, but I felt zero sympathy. His excuses melted together into a pathetic symphony of betrayal. I told him we were done. No friendship could survive this. He hung his head, muttered something about a mistake, and walked away. My heart pounded mercilessly. Lisa tried to talk to me daily. I wouldn't say we talked so much as I watched her beg for a second chance while I stared into the distance. I wanted to scream, but I also felt a numbness creeping in. She claimed she loved me, that she was confused, that Tim had manipulated her. I listened silently, refusing to give her the closure of my rage. After a week of this, I told her to move out. She refused at first, sobbing about how she belonged with me, but I insisted. The betrayal was irreparable, and I wasn't budging. She left to stay with her sister, who lived a few miles away. I was numb, but I started seeing a therapist. I needed someone to talk to who wouldn't judge me or offer platitudes. Week after week, I unloaded my anger, sadness, and confusion, trying to piece together a future from the wreckage. Meanwhile, Tim avoided me at all costs. He stopped coming to mutual gatherings, resigned from our sports league, and acted like I no longer existed. Some part of me craved a confrontation, but he was too much of a coward. That, at least, was completely unsurprising. 2 months later, Lisa requested a meeting. She said she had something important to share, and it couldn't wait. We met at a coffee shop near my workplace. She looked pale, eyes rimmed with circles of exhaustion. I steeled myself for more apologies or pleas. Instead, she told me she was pregnant with Tim's child. My mind reeled. I knew they hadn't been careful, but hearing it said out loud was another twist of the knife. She wanted me to know that Tim had disappeared after learning the news, and she was completely alone. I simply said nothing and left. The next day, she showed up at my place, frantic. She said she had nowhere else to go, that her sister's place was too cramped. She wanted to move back in, at least until she figured things out. I wanted to refuse. My pride screamed at me to slam the door, but a small voice inside reminded me that she was pregnant and truly alone. I told her she could stay for a week, no more. She clung to me, sobbing her thanks, but I felt no warmth. I only felt the heaviness of a responsibility I never asked for. For the first few days, we barely spoke. She slept in the guest room, and I went about my routine in silence. I couldn't forgive her, but I also couldn't throw a pregnant woman onto the streets. One evening, she broke down at the dinner table. She told me Tim had blocked her calls and refused any financial support. She confessed she'd thought about terminating the pregnancy, but couldn't bring herself to do it. As she sobbed, I felt a cold detachment. Her suffering was a direct consequence of their betrayal, and I was in no mood to grant absolution. 2 weeks later, I told her the week was up. She pleaded for more time, tears streaming down her cheeks. I refused, reminding her this was never meant to be a permanent arrangement. She could go back to her sister or find some other solution. I was completely through letting her mistakes invade my space. Before she left, she dropped a bombshell. She said she still loved me. I stared at her incredulous. Love? After everything? I told her love meant loyalty, and she'd proven she had absolutely none. She left with her suitcase, her eyes filled with silent desperation. Over the next few months, I threw myself into work and therapy. I started going to the gym more, trying to vent my anger in healthier ways. Friends asked questions, but I kept the details private. The only person who knew everything was my therapist. Occasionally, I'd see Lisa's social media posts, vague updates about her pregnancy, or requests for help. She never directed them at me, probably out of shame or stubbornness. I found myself scrolling through Tim's accounts too. They were inactive, like he'd vanished. Part of me wanted to find him just to unleash my unrelenting fury, but I had no desire for legal trouble, so I resisted tracking him down. Instead, I served Lisa with divorce papers. There was no hope for our marriage. She didn't fight it, probably knowing her position was weak. The proceedings were straightforward. We had no kids together, no shared mortgage because we were renting. She cried when she signed, but I felt nothing. After the divorce was final, I blocked her on everything, determined to move forward. My life settled into a somber rhythm, yet completely free of her presence, but weighed down by bitterness I couldn't quite shake off. Months passed. I found a strange sense of stability. My sessions with the therapist helped, and I even went on a couple of dates, although nothing serious. Then, out of the blue, Lisa showed up at my workplace. She was visibly pregnant, her belly round, her expression desperate. She asked if we could talk privately. I hesitated, but I didn't want a scene, so I led her to an empty conference room. She told me Tim still hadn't surfaced, she couldn't afford her medical bills, and she had absolutely truly nowhere else to turn. She was pleading for my help. I stared at her, unsure whether to laugh or scream. She wanted help from the man she had betrayed in the cruelest way possible. I asked if she'd considered adoption. She shook her head, saying she couldn't bear to give the baby up. Then I asked about social services, government assistance, anything but me. She lowered her gaze, acknowledging she'd already tried all those avenues. I felt cornered. A bitter sense of satisfaction flickered inside me, seeing her so desperate. But I also remembered how I once loved her, which made the moment feel even more twisted. It felt profoundly surreal. I refused to give her money. Instead, I told her I'd help track down Tim and make him face his responsibilities. She balked, saying she'd tried contacting him to no avail. I explained that we could hire a private investigator if necessary. She looked torn, as though she desperately hoped I'd just hand over cash. I completely refused to be her safety net. If Tim was the father, he needed to step up. She started crying, but I stood firm. I wouldn't fund her life. She left without a clear resolution, leaving me utterly unsettled but resolute in my decision. I wasn't bluffing about hiring a private investigator. Within a week, I'd retained a small firm recommended by a colleague. They found Tim in another city, living under the radar, working odd jobs for cash. When I got the address, I felt a rush of adrenaline. Part of me wanted to confront him physically, but I knew that wasn't wise. Instead, I informed Lisa of his whereabouts. If she wanted child support or accountability, she'd have to initiate it. I even gave her the contact details of a lawyer. This was her problem, not mine. My conscience felt much lighter. Lisa tried to call me multiple times after that, presumably to discuss Tim. I never answered. She left messages saying she was scared he'd dodge financial responsibilities and that she needed my advice. I deleted them all. I was done playing the savior for someone who had destroyed our marriage. If Tim wanted to run, that was between them. My heart still burned with anger, but ignoring her pleas felt like a small taste of revenge. She had chosen him, and now she could face the consequences alone. I had finally firmly drawn a boundary and intended to keep it. Months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Lisa had given birth to a boy. Tim was summoned to court for paternity, confirmed as the father, and ordered to pay child support. He apparently completely vanished again, leaving her in the lurch. Part of me found it satisfying, knowing that their toxic union had collapsed. Another part of me felt a deep tinge of regret that things had ever come to this. Still, I reminded myself that this outcome was entirely of their making. I continued building my life, refusing to be dragged back into their chaos or their pain. As time went on, I started dating seriously again. I met someone new, Jessica. She was thoughtful, understanding, and had an empathy I found refreshing. She knew I was divorced, but I kept the ugly details private for a long while. Eventually, I opened up, sharing the story of Lisa's betrayal. Jessica listened without judgment and told me I deserved slightly better. It felt validating, hearing that from someone who wasn't biased by history. I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was actually hopeful about love. My bitterness didn't evaporate, but it finally loosened its grip. One evening, nearly a year later, Lisa contacted me through a mutual friend's phone. She asked to meet, claiming it was urgent. I debated ignoring her, but curiosity won. We met at a quiet diner. She looked exhausted, like life had worn her down. She spoke about how Tim was completely absent, how she was drowning in bills, and how she realized she had ruined our marriage for nothing. She asked if I could ever forgive her, if we could start over. I stared at her, remembering every knife she'd twisted. My answer was immediate. No, forgiveness wasn't on offer. Her eyes filled with tears, and she tried to hold my hand. I pulled away. She insisted she had changed, that she understood her mistakes. She begged for another chance. But all I felt was a heavy finality. I told her that love cannot survive betrayal, and my self-respect wouldn't allow me to ever re-enter that nightmare. She broke down, sobbing about how incredibly lonely she was, how sorry she felt. I just watched, strangely calm. After everything, I no longer felt the need to yell. I simply shook my head, paid my bill, and walked out without looking back. That was the last time I saw her in person. She tried calling me a few more times, always with the same request for forgiveness or a plea for emotional support. I never responded. I had given her my answer, and I meant it. Meanwhile, Jessica and I grew closer. She eventually moved in with me, and life began to feel normal again, maybe even happy. I learned that betrayal leaves scars, but it doesn't have to define your entire future. I channeled my pain into building something better. In a strange way, Lisa had taught me exactly what I deserved. Just when I thought the chapter had closed, Tim resurfaced. He sent me a long-winded email claiming he was a changed man. He wrote about how he'd hit rock bottom and found religion, and he wanted my forgiveness too. He tried to portray himself as a victim of circumstance, whining about how he'd been aimless and fell into temptation. I stared at the words, feeling a powerful wave of disgust. He had ruined our friendship, betrayed me in the worst way, and completely abandoned his own child. I owed him utterly nothing. I deleted the email without a second thought. That email solidified my stance. Some betrayals are unforgivable. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I had rebuilt my life without them, and I wasn't about to let their remorse manipulate me. The memory of their betrayal still stung, but it guided my boundaries. I cut off all final threads linking us. No more lurking on their social media, no more mutual friends passing along messages. If either of them wanted to reach me, they'd find only silence. My life was my own again, and I intended to keep it that way. The past would stay in the past forever. Time truly does soften some wounds. 2 years after the divorce, I proposed to Jessica. She said yes, and for the first time in ages, I felt genuine peace. The wedding was small, attended by close friends and family. I didn't invite Lisa or Tim, obviously. That part of my life had been closed off. As I stood there with Jessica, I reflected on how betrayal had nearly broken me. But in a strange twist, it had also shown me my own resilience. Every scar told me I deserved real love, the kind that doesn't shatter at the first temptation. Years later, I sometimes hear rumors. Lisa struggles to raise her son, juggling multiple jobs. Tim owes back child support, occasionally surfaces, then disappears again. Neither of them ever found what they were looking for. I'm not gloating, but I'm not sympathetic either. They chose their path. I chose mine, and I learned that my forgiveness is not a guarantee. Some lines, once crossed, remain deeply forever. Betrayal carries a harsh cost, and they both paid dearly. My life with Jessica is far from perfect, but it's built on honesty and respect. I refuse to let old ghosts haunt us. Looking back, I see how easily it could have utterly destroyed me. The anger, the betrayal, the humiliation of being cheated on by my wife and best friend, it could have turned me bitter forever. But I chose a different path. I chose therapy, self-reflection, and eventually a new relationship that valued loyalty. My revenge was simple, living a life where they no longer had any power over me. I never had to curse their names or stoop to vindictive acts. I just removed them from my life and watched them struggle in the mess they created. That was truly enough. In the end, I realized that real justice sometimes comes from letting people face the consequences of their actions. Neither Lisa nor Tim won in this scenario. Their fling destroyed friendships, shattered trust, and left them to cope with a child they never planned for. Meanwhile, I moved on, stronger in my convictions and clearer about what I would never tolerate again. Their betrayal did not define me, but it did enlighten me. It showed me that I could endure unimaginable hurt and still rebuild. That, more than anything, is what I carry forward. My life is finally my own. So this is my story, the unvarnished truth of how my wife cheated on me with my best friend, got pregnant by him, and then tried to crawl back. There was no forgiveness, only the cold satisfaction of knowing I walked away with my dignity. They sought atonement when their own choices collapsed around them, but I had none to give. In the aftermath, I found the power to shape my destiny without their shadows looming over me. I chose self-respect over reconciliation, and I've never regretted it. This is how I learned that sometimes revenge is simply living well. I always thought my mother was complicated. She had a sharp tongue and a sharper sense of survival. She raised me on her own, as my father vanished when I was too young to remember him. I noticed she had a knack for latching on to quick schemes and questionable ideas. I tried to trust her, but there were red flags along the way. Whenever money came up, she got defensive. When I graduated from high school, I resolved to attend college without burdening her. That meant working every shift I could find and setting aside my earnings, hoping that someday I'd be able to transfer to a 4-year university. It took years, but I saved $50,000 hard-earned dollars total. I kept that money in a savings account under my name, thinking I'd made it secure. My mother knew about it because I once mentioned my plan to leave for a good university. She acted impressed, but I could see a strange gleam in her eye. I dismissed it, believing she'd be proud rather than predatory. One afternoon, I got home from work to find a notice from my bank stating there had been unusual activity. When I checked, my balance was zero. I panicked and called the bank, but they said I'd authorized a transfer. I couldn't believe it. My mother had somehow forged my signature. By the time I realized it, she had vanished, leaving an emptiness behind. I learned she had withdrawn everything and booked a flight to Spain. It wasn't a vacation. She wasn't coming back. I tried contacting old relatives, but they had no idea where she was. I filed a police report, but the detective said my chances of recovering the money were slim. I was devastated. For days, I couldn't sleep or eat properly. Every waking moment felt like a betrayal replaying in my head. I raged and thought about what kind of person does this to their own child. I felt alone, stuck with rent, bills, and no tuition fund. That money was my entire future, and she stole it without blinking. I promised myself I would never forgive her for this. I started working extra shifts. I took on late-night cleaning gigs, early morning deliveries, and weekend bartending. It was exhausting, but I told myself I wouldn't let her destroy my life. Meanwhile, I saw social media posts indicating she was partying in Madrid with strangers who seemed more like opportunists than friends. She'd upload a photo in a fancy restaurant or a club, always smiling. It made my blood boil. People kept asking where she got the money for that lifestyle, and she'd joke about a windfall. Every day, I waited for a sign that she'd realize her mistake or at least feel remorse. But that never came. The more I scrolled, the clearer it was. She had no shame. I decided not to cry over it anymore. Instead, I set up a plan to gather every piece of evidence I could. I contacted the bank, got copies of the transfer documents, and saved all her social media updates. I wanted to prove she'd stolen from me. My idea was to keep building a case in case an opportunity arose. I got in touch with a lawyer who specialized in international matters, but his fee was insane. He told me that we'd have to file suits in both countries, and there was no guarantee of success. I thanked him for his time and realized I was on my own. Still, I felt compelled to remain vigilant, hoping for a breakthrough. I tried not to let anger consume me, but whenever I thought about her laughing somewhere abroad, I seethed. To cope, I talked to friends, vented in online forums, and even saw a therapist briefly. It helped me find perspective. My mother had always been a taker. She had borrowed money from relatives, lied about paying them back, and even manipulated me into covering her debts more than once. This was simply the biggest betrayal yet, and I couldn't ignore it. Sometimes, people asked if I'd ever speak to her again if she returned. I said no. My trust was shattered. She crossed a line I never ever thought possible. I didn't care if she was my mother or not. About a year passed. I worked relentlessly, saving whatever I could, though it was nowhere near that original amount. One day, out of nowhere, I got a message on Facebook from a woman in Spain who claimed she knew my mother. She said my mother was in trouble. I was skeptical, thinking it could be another scam, but curiosity got the best of me, so I replied. The woman explained that my mother had befriended some dangerous people and racked up debts she couldn't pay. Now they were really threatening her. She was desperate and had asked this woman to contact me, thinking I'd bail her out. My stomach twisted with equal parts anxiety and anger. After all she'd done, I wondered if this was some cosmic payback. She had stolen from me, and now karma had come knocking on her door. I asked the woman how she'd found me, and she said my mother had confessed to having a child in the States. She gave her my name and told her to beg me for money. It was surreal, like I was suddenly responsible for her. But I felt nothing but bitterness, no sympathy or concern whatsoever. I told the woman I had nothing to give. That was the truth. Even if I'd had millions, I wouldn't have rescued her. She chose her path, betrayed me, and expected a bailout. I refused to be her safety net ever again. The woman insisted my mother had run out of options. She said my mother had borrowed from a local loan shark and gambled most of it away. When the debts mounted, she tried scamming other expats, but that ended badly. I listened, feeling an odd mix of satisfaction and horror. Part of me wanted to see her suffer for what she did. Another part couldn't believe how reckless she had become. She was living from hostel to hostel, dodging calls and changing phone numbers. The woman asked if I could at least send enough for her to buy a plane ticket back to the States. I refused. My mother dug this hole. Let her figure out how to climb out. I blocked that woman on Facebook, anticipating further pleas. The next few days, I felt uneasy, wondering if my mother would show up at my door. I doubted she had the money to return, but I knew she was cunning. Part of me feared she might do something desperate. However, nothing happened. Weeks passed without any updates. I resumed my routine, ignoring the knot of unresolved anger in my chest. Then, I received an email from an unknown address. It was a single line. "I'm sorry, please help me." I recognized my mother's tone. Instead of pity, I felt a spike of rage. She'd never apologized for stealing my money. This sudden contrition was just another manipulative and empty tactic. I didn't reply. I archived the email and tried to focus on my life. Over the next week, she sent more messages, each more desperate than the last. She claimed she had nowhere to sleep, nothing to eat, and enemies were after her. She even wrote, "You owe me this," which made my blood boil. How could she think I owed her anything? She stole my education fund and spent it on frivolous luxuries. Now that she was in trouble, I was supposed to rescue her? I blocked every new address she used. My only regret was that I hadn't cut her out of my life completely long ago. People say blood is thicker than water, but I'd had enough. A month later, my roommate handed me a letter that came in the mail. It was postmarked from Spain, written in my mother's shaky handwriting. My heart pounded as I tore it open. She rambled about regret, how she never meant to hurt me, how she'd pay me back someday. It was filled with excuses. She'd been lonely, depressed, tricked by bad influencers. She claimed she wanted to come home, but was terrified of what awaited her. I read every line carefully, looking for any sign of genuine remorse. It all sounded like nonsense designed to squeeze my sympathy. She asked for forgiveness, but never once mentioned the $50,000 she stole. My raw and bitter anger flared all over again. I decided to consult a friend who had lived abroad. He suggested that I tip off local authorities in Spain, offering them evidence that she was fleeing financial fraud in the States. At first, I hesitated. She was still my mother, no matter how terrible, but the rage I felt over the stolen money and her heartless attitude pushed me forward. I gathered every piece of proof I had, including copies of her confession in that letter, and emailed it to the police in Madrid. I didn't know if they'd care or if it would lead to anything. All I knew was that I wanted her to face consequences. I refused to let her keep leeching off unsuspecting people overseas. A few weeks later, I got a brief email from a Spanish officer acknowledging they received my information. They couldn't promise swift action, but they said they'd look into it. I didn't expect a miracle. I focused on rebuilding my own life, paying off student loans I'd taken out, and working toward a stable future. The anger never fully went away, but it dulled over time. Then, out of the blue, I got a message from my aunt. She said my mother had been arrested in Spain for involvement in a fraud scheme. Apparently, she'd tried to con a tourist who turned out to be an undercover cop. I felt an unholy satisfaction, though part of me still felt numb. My aunt asked if I wanted updates. I agreed, mostly out of morbid curiosity. She discovered that my mother faced charges for multiple scams, including forging documents and identity theft. The Spanish authorities also learned about the outstanding warrant in the States. It looked like she could be extradited after serving time there. My aunt seemed conflicted, urging me to let go of my grudge. I told her that forgiveness wasn't completely in my heart. My mother had made her bed. She needed to lie in it. I wasn't about to pretend everything was fine. The theft of my future had changed me. I was determined to move on, but not at the cost of letting her off easy now. My mother languished in a Spanish jail while I continued my life. My aunt relayed that she was miserable, complaining about the conditions, begging for someone to bail her out. No one stepped forward. Her so-called friends had vanished. The authorities built a case linking her to other fraudulent activities. She wrote me letters from prison, but I ignored them. My time was better spent focusing on the future. I landed a better job and got a partial scholarship. Those small victories reminded me that I didn't need her help or her approval anymore. The woman who had destroyed my trust was just a stranger now, far away. I felt a sense of closure, though not complete. 6 months later, she was convicted in Spain. I heard she received a few years behind bars, with the possibility of additional time if the United States pressed charges. My aunt sounded worried, but I felt almost nothing. I'd run out of empathy. Maybe that made me cold, but I saw it as self-preservation. Meanwhile, I managed to secure enough financial aid to enroll in a state university, finishing my degree in business administration. Every accomplishment felt like a step away from her shadow. I dated sparingly, afraid to let anyone too close after so much betrayal. But I eventually learned to open up again, realizing not everyone was out to use me. Slowly, I rebuilt my sense of self. One day, I got a call from a lawyer claiming to represent my mother. She wanted to arrange a settlement regarding the stolen money. My heart pounded. Could I finally get restitution? The lawyer explained that she had arranged to transfer some assets to me if I agreed to drop any further claims. I demanded details. Apparently, she had a small inheritance from her late father that she never touched. She was willing to sign it over, hoping I'd help reduce her impending legal troubles in the States. I felt torn, but then I remembered how she exploited me. I refused to sign anything until I saw proof. I wasn't about to fall for yet another of her schemes. The lawyer sent documents showing the inheritance's value at around $30,000, significantly less than what she owed me. I told him it wasn't enough. Even if it were, I had no reason to help her dodge accountability. She chose her path, and she could face the consequences. He tried to convince me that this might be my only chance to recover some money. I thought about it for a few days, but my pride wouldn't let me settle for less, especially not on her terms. If I took that money, it felt like letting her buy my forgiveness. I refused. I'd rather earn my future honestly than accept blood money from the woman who ruined everything. The lawyer grew frustrated, hinting that this deal would disappear if I waited too long. I laughed, telling him he could let it vanish for all I cared. After that, I heard nothing more about any settlement. It felt like a weight lifted off my shoulders, as if I'd finally decided that my mother's influence over me was zero. My life improved in small increments. I found a new roommate who was supportive, I made steady progress at work, and I even started a side business with a friend. Each milestone reminded me I wasn't defined by her betrayal. She could rot in a foreign prison and then face charges back home. I no longer felt any obligation. After serving a portion of her sentence, she was extradited to the United States. My aunt told me they flew her back in handcuffs, facing charges of fraud and forgery. That news didn't bring me happiness or sadness, just relief that the system was finally catching up with her. Old family friends reached out, asking if I'd visit her in jail. I declined. It didn't matter how many times they said, "She's still your mother." That bond meant nothing after she obliterated my trust. I had no desire to see her face. I imagined she'd spin another sob story, expecting tears and a warm hug, but I'd given her enough of my life already. I had none left to spare. A year later, I graduated with honors. My father's side of the family, who I'd reconnected with, threw me a small celebration. They knew about my mother's betrayal, but never pried for details. I appreciated their respect. During the party, I learned my mother had been sentenced to more prison time. She wrote me a letter from her new cell, claiming she'd found religion and was ready to repent. She even said I was the only family she had left. But I tore the letter up without finishing it. I refused to let her words poison my milestone. My achievements were my own, financed by my sweat, not the money she stole. I wouldn't let her overshadow this day. Life continued to move forward. I found a decent job, moved into a nicer apartment, and started building the future I'd always dreamed of. My mother remained locked away, occasionally sending pathetic letters. Sometimes, I'd burn them without reading. Other times, I'd glance over them just to confirm my resolve. They were always the same pleas for forgiveness, for a second chance, for empathy. But I was done. My boundaries were firm. She stole $50,000 from me, ran off, and never once showed genuine remorse before her life collapsed. Now that she was behind bars, she claimed she'd changed. I believed people can change, but I didn't owe her anything. She had squandered her last chance. Over time, I saved enough to make a partial payment on a master's degree program. It felt surreal considering where I started. I refused to let her betrayal define my limits. Friends asked if I ever planned to confront her in person, just to get closure. The thought crossed my mind, but each time I pictured it, I saw her manipulative tears and fake apologies. I realized closure had to come from within. I'd already taken my power back. Meeting her face-to-face wouldn't restore my lost money or my trust. It would only reopen wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. So I let the years roll by, content to leave her in my past. Eventually, I heard she was up for parole. My aunt hinted that she wanted me to speak on her behalf. I refused. She robbed me of my education fund, fled the country, and lived large while I struggled. She never apologized until she was desperate. I owed her nothing. When she was denied parole, I felt no triumph, just a cold finality. I went home, looked at my college diploma, and reminded myself that my life was mine. She'd tried to ruin my future, but I'd reclaimed it. Maybe she'd get out someday, but I'd never forget or forgive. That was my final stand. No more illusions, no more pity. She made her choice, and I made mine. I was 16 when my father packed his bags and left our home for good. At the time, my mother was in the kitchen, frantically checking the oven timer as she tried to salvage a half-burned chicken. She kept fiddling with the temperature dial, muttering that she was losing her touch. Dad stood in the foyer with a dull expression, occasionally glancing at the door like it was some promised escape route. I remember him telling me to move aside so he could get through with his suitcase. He didn't look at me directly, just brushed past as though I was an inconvenient piece of furniture. Until then, I never questioned his occasional late nights at work or the suspicious phone calls he'd take in private. I thought maybe he had some big project, something that required secrecy, and I felt proud he was trusted with such responsibilities. Mom never hinted at anything being wrong, or if she did, I was too clueless to notice. I found out the truth a month later, overhearing a heated conversation between my mother and her sister. That's when I learned Dad hadn't simply decided to leave. He'd been planning this with his new girlfriend for quite some time, sneaking around for months, maybe even a year. When Mom discovered that Dad was actually living with some young woman across town, she called him every name in the book and slammed the phone so hard the plastic cracked. The entire situation felt like a twisted dream. I'd grown up believing my father was the kind of man who'd never abandon us, who would never betray my mother like this. But there he was, cozy in a new apartment with a woman half his age. She was barely in her 20s, younger than some cousins. Mom tried her best to hold herself together after that. She'd wake up at dawn, go for a jog, and claim it was her way of blowing off steam. But I caught her some nights, sitting at the dining table, looking at old family photos while tears streamed down her face. She wasn't the type to confide in me, so I didn't push. Instead, I did what I could, made sure the bills were paid on time, kept the house clean, and reminded her to eat. I remember the day I snuck into her room to check if she was even drinking water. She was lying on the bed, still in her workout clothes, staring at the ceiling fan. When I asked if she needed anything, she just shook her head and told me she was fine, though she didn't sound like it. There's a certain kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than anything else, and for my mother, this was it. She'd married my father right after high school, believing he was her soulmate. Everything in her world revolved around him and me. And so, when he left, she lost her anchor. For a while, she tried to keep up appearances, telling friends she was okay with the separation, that she was glad to have her independence. But I noticed how she cringed whenever she got any letter or notification addressed to Mrs. instead of Ms. My father, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. He'd call occasionally, not to ask about Mom, but to check on me. At first, I appreciated his concern, but then I realized he was just going through the motions. The sincerity I used to associate with him was gone. Everything about him felt hollow, like he was following a script provided by someone else. I still answered his calls, mostly out of habit or guilt. My mother never said I couldn't talk to him, but she also never asked if I wanted to. She assumed I'd make my own choices. What really stung was the knowledge that my father's new girlfriend, who I'll call Naomi, was someone I'd seen once at his office. I had gone there to drop off a folder Mom had forgotten to give him. Naomi was at the reception desk, flashing a smile at everyone who passed by. I thought she was just a friendly colleague, maybe an intern. Later, I found out she was more than that. She was the one Dad had chosen to be with, the reason he walked away from us. As the months passed, I tried to build a semblance of normalcy. I picked up a part-time job at a local bookstore to support Mom, even though she insisted I focus on my studies. On weekends, I'd help around the house, trying to fill the void Dad left behind. Mom still jogged every morning, still occasionally stared at old photo albums, but she was making small strides. She started going out with a friend from work, even joined a yoga class, and her eyes didn't look as hollow as before. We were coping, slowly. Dad would pop into my life at random intervals, inviting me to lunch or asking if I wanted to see a movie. I turned down most of his offers, but one day I accepted. I guess a part of me still craved a father figure, or maybe I just wanted to see how he was living. That's how I ended up at his new apartment, standing near the door while Naomi offered me a glass of water. I hesitated, then accepted. The place looked more like a trendy hotel suite than a home. Everything was modern, shiny, and arranged with a precision that suggested a professional decorator. Naomi seemed overly eager to impress me, talking about how she'd picked out the artwork on the walls, how she planned to make the living room cozier with some throw pillows. She talked quickly, as though she were trying to convince me she was actually a warm person. Dad just hovered, occasionally placing a hand on her shoulder and giving me a forced grin. I could smell something cooking, but it didn't feel inviting. It felt staged. When we sat down to eat, Naomi asked me about school, my hobbies, and if I liked sports. She even teased my father about how he never mentioned I was so tall. The entire scene grated on my nerves. Maybe she was trying to be nice, but I resented every syllable out of her mouth. This was the woman who had destroyed my home life, or at least contributed to its downfall, and now she was acting as if we were going to be friends. I answered her politely, but kept my responses short. Dad looked relieved I wasn't openly hostile, which just made me more determined to maintain my composure. After dinner, he suggested we watch a movie. Naomi nestled beside him on the couch, and I felt an instinctive need to leave. I used an excuse about homework, stood up, and told them both I had to get going. Naomi offered to drive me home, but I shook my head. I wanted to walk, to clear my thoughts. As I left, she waved goodbye with an expression I couldn't read. My father, for his part, looked conflicted but said nothing. I felt nothing but distance. I didn't tell Mom about the visit. She had enough on her plate, and I didn't want to upset her, but I kept replaying that dinner in my head, especially the way Naomi looked at me. There was something off about it, but I couldn't pinpoint why. A week later, Dad texted me, asking if I'd like to come by again. I thought about ignoring him, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see if there was any real connection left between us. I agreed, half expecting the same awkward meal. This time, though, Dad said Naomi wouldn't be there. She had gone to visit her parents. When I arrived, he offered me a soda and tried to chat about my classes, my friends, and anything else he thought might spark conversation. I played along, giving him brief updates, but I was too distracted by the way the apartment felt different without Naomi. It was quieter, emptier, and oddly more comfortable. At one point, I asked how Mom's lawyer had been in contact with him. He looked surprised, then annoyed, and said he was handling it. I wanted to push further, but I decided against it. I'd gleaned enough to know he was anxious about the divorce proceedings, especially regarding finances. He tried to brush it off, changing the subject to a new sports car he wanted to buy. The entire conversation made me question his priorities. He'd left my mother and me in an emotional mess, yet here he was fantasizing about fancy cars. Before I left, Dad gave me a hug. It was the first real hug since he'd walked out. For a moment, I felt something that resembled the father I once knew, but the feeling vanished the second I stepped out the door. Over time, Naomi started texting me. She got my number from Dad, obviously. At first, it was innocent stuff like asking if I'd be attending some family get-together or if I needed help with anything at school. Then, her messages became oddly personal. She asked about my favorite music, joked that she and I should go clubbing once I turned 18. I tried to ignore these hints, but she kept pushing. She sent me memes, videos, and random pictures of her day, as if we were best friends. It was unsettling. I didn't mention it to my mom, but I started feeling uneasy every time my phone buzzed. One evening, Naomi called me. Her voice was playful, almost flirtatious. She teased me about how I must have all the girls at school swooning over me. It felt wrong to hear that from my father's girlfriend, and I quickly ended the call. But she wouldn't let up. She began sending me messages that were more suggestive, though she cloaked them in jokes. She'd send winking emojis, talk about how mature I seemed for my age, and even asked if I ever thought she was pretty. Each time, I responded with vague politeness, hoping she'd take the hint. She didn't. If anything, my reluctance seemed to egg her on. I started saving screenshots and recording voice notes whenever she called. A part of me felt guilty, like I was setting her up. But another part of me knew this was beyond normal. If Dad ever accused me of lying, I wanted proof. I hated the idea of betraying him further, but I couldn't overlook what Naomi was doing. Eventually, I had enough. I compiled everything into a single folder, uncertain of how or when I'd use it. My patience was wearing thin. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, Mom seemed to grow stronger. She took on extra hours at her job and began talking to new people, making plans that didn't revolve around Dad's schedule. Meanwhile, I wrestled with the secret of Naomi's behavior. I wanted to protect my father, but a bigger part of me felt betrayed by him anyway. One day, I was at the bookstore when Naomi showed up unannounced. She wandered through the aisles until she found me, then tried to flirt openly, giggling about how she'd love to see me outside of work. I kept my cool, reminding her there was a significant age gap and that she was with my father. She just brushed it off, saying age was nothing but a number. I was mortified someone might overhear, so I led her to a corner of the store and asked her to leave. She pouted playfully, which only made me angrier. After she left, my hands were shaking. That was the moment I decided I couldn't keep this under wraps anymore. I needed to confront Dad. That night, I called him and told him we had to talk in person. No Naomi, no distractions. He sounded concerned, maybe even scared. We set up a meeting at a nearby diner. I brought my phone, where I'd saved all the evidence. My heart pounded so loudly, I could hardly hear my own thoughts. When Dad arrived, he looked anxious. We ordered coffee, but neither of us drank it. I told him straight out. Naomi had been crossing lines, texting me in ways that made me uncomfortable, and even showing up at my workplace. I watched his face go pale. He tried to speak, but I held up my hand. That's when I played the recorded voice notes. Hearing Naomi's voice echo in that tense diner booth felt surreal. There were playful comments, little innuendos, and even a sly suggestion that we meet up alone. My father's expression ranged from shock to anger to something that looked like wounded pride. When it ended, he asked why I hadn't told him sooner. His tone implied I'd somehow betrayed him by waiting. I asked him how I was supposed to trust a man who'd already broken our family apart. That shut him up for a moment. Then, almost on cue, Naomi walked into the diner, spotting us at the corner table. She slid into the booth next to Dad and tried to kiss him on the cheek. He pushed her away, his face completely pale. She asked what was going on, glancing from my father's clenched jaw to my phone on the table. I took one look at her and felt disgust. This was the person who'd replaced my mother, and now she was trying to wedge herself between my father and me in more ways than one. I told her she needed to back off and that I had evidence of her inappropriate behavior. She rolled her eyes, refusing to take me seriously. Dad demanded to see her phone, and she actually refused at first, which told us everything we needed to know. Finally, she relented. My father scrolled through message after message, his face growing darker with every line. Naomi tried to spin it, claiming it was just harmless banter, that she was messing around. But Dad wasn't buying it. He looked more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Before I got up to leave, I told him I was done. He might have chosen her over us, but I refused to be part of their twisted dynamic. I walked out, leaving them both in that booth, and I didn't look back. Dad tried calling me multiple times over the next few days, but I let it go to voicemail. He left long messages apologizing, asking me to reconsider, saying he never meant for any of this to happen. At first, I felt tempted to hear him out, but every time I remembered how he'd destroyed my mother's life, I hardened my resolve. He'd broken our trust, and I had no reason to spare his feelings anymore. Meanwhile, Mom finally got the divorce settlement she deserved. Dad was forced to pay alimony and some compensation because of the clear evidence of infidelity. I never told her about Naomi's flirting. She'd endured enough humiliation as it was. As for me, I decided to focus on my own future. I put in more hours at the bookstore, saved up enough to visit a few colleges, and even considered moving out of state to start fresh. Occasionally, I'd run into Dad in random places, once at a gas station, another time at the mall. Both times, he looked like he wanted to say something, but I just gave him a curt nod and walked away. I wasn't interested in hearing excuses or apologies anymore. One afternoon, Naomi texted me from a new number, pleading that she never meant to harm me, that Dad had left her because of what happened. She begged me not to ruin her life any further. I blocked her without responding. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could manipulate me again. Eventually, Dad must have gotten the message. He stopped calling, stopped texting, and faded from my life like a bad memory. My resolve only grew stronger with each passing day, unwavering forever. I graduated from high school the next year. Mom cheered the loudest in the auditorium, her eyes shining with pride. She seemed like a different person, more confident and at peace with herself. After the ceremony, we grabbed dinner with a few close friends, laughing over memories and sharing our hopes for the future. I didn't invite Dad. He'd sent me a card and a small gift, but I left them unopened on my desk. Some might call it petty. I call it self-preservation. He made his choices, and so did I. When I eventually moved out for college, I took a single box of old photos with me, mostly pictures of Mom and me. The few that included Dad were from years ago, back when I believed he was the kind of man who'd stand by his family. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of those pictures and feel a twinge of sadness. But then I'd remember everything he did, the lies, the betrayal, the emotional havoc. The sadness would morph into resolve. I wasn't going to let his mistakes define my future. My father tried to reach out one last time, emailing me a lengthy apology after I'd started my freshman year. He talked about regrets, about wanting to make amends, about how Naomi had been a huge mistake. I read every word, then deleted the email. Some things just can't be fixed. Maybe one day he'll understand that actions have consequences. Maybe he already does. In any case, it's not my responsibility to soothe his guilt. My loyalty belongs to my mother and myself. He took everything that mattered and threw it away for a fleeting thrill. I hope it was worth it for him. As for me, I don't owe him forgiveness. I owe myself peace and dignity. I used to believe that your partner's loyalty was guaranteed, especially after years together. Marisol and I dated for almost 3 years, and we seemed like the perfect couple, always supporting each other. When we first met, she was shy, uncertain about her future, but she found confidence in my unwavering encouragement. I had a stable job in sales, making good money, and I was proud to help her finish college and manage her student loans. She always said she was grateful I was there. I thought our relationship was built on real love. But everything changed the moment I got sick. I still remember the day I was diagnosed with cancer. The doctor's voice sounded calm, but I heard an invisible hammer pounding my chest. I wasn't old, I wasn't in terrible shape, and yet there it was. I thought Marisol would cry and then gather her strength, telling me we'd fight this together. But instead of unwavering support, I noticed a strange distance in her eyes. She told me she was scared, that she never imagined dealing with a sick partner at our age. I asked her to stand by me, hoping she'd be the shoulder I could lean on. At first, she claimed she'd do whatever it took, but her behavior changed. She stopped asking how I was feeling. She spent more time out with her friends. When my treatment plan kicked in and I was too tired to cook or clean, she complained. I saw frustration in her eyes whenever I mentioned my fatigue. I tried explaining that chemotherapy hit me like a truck, but she only expressed regret about how my condition affected our finances. I had to cut back on work, meaning smaller paychecks. She rarely offered to help with medical bills. She simply drifted away. After 3 months of trying to maintain our life, I was physically exhausted and my bank account was slowly bleeding. My doctor advised me to take a long leave from work because my immune system was compromised. I remember sitting Marisol down, explaining that I'd need more emotional support than ever. She looked at me with pity, as though I were already gone. Then she said, "I'm sorry, but this is too big for me." Those words felt like a hammer blow. I begged her to reconsider, but she had already decided. She packed her things and left me behind. I couldn't chase after her. Even if I wanted to, my body wouldn't cooperate. It crushed me to think that she left me because I was sick and couldn't earn like before. I'd helped her through her struggles, always stepping in when she was down, but now she was gone. My parents stepped in to assist with some bills. My siblings helped me by driving me to appointments. I did everything I could to stay afloat. The betrayal hurt more than the cancer itself. I felt disgusted that someone I loved could abandon me at my lowest point. It stung. I tried to distract myself by focusing on recovery. My medical team gave me hope. They said that although my form of cancer was aggressive, it was also treatable. I underwent every recommended therapy, from chemotherapy to specialized drugs. It wasn't easy, but I clung to the possibility of getting my old life back. I daydreamed about returning to work, feeling healthy, and maybe even trying a new relationship someday. I had dark days where I could barely move, but I refused to let despair win. Anger toward Marisol somehow fueled my resolve to survive. I wanted to outlive heartbreak. Over the next year, my body responded well to treatment, and the cancer went into remission. My hair grew back, my appetite returned, and I gradually regained strength. With my doctor's blessing, I started looking for work again. Although my old position wasn't available, a friend recommended me for a role in a smaller company. It didn't pay as much as I used to earn, but it was something. I began to rebuild my life, one piece at a time. I never heard from Marisol during that period, not a single text, call, or email. She was gone for good. Once I felt healthier, I realized I was filled with a quiet rage. I had given Marisol everything I could, but she bolted the second things got tough. The memory of her betrayal lingered in the back of my mind. Instead of letting it corrode me, I directed that fury into self-improvement. I went to the gym, worked on my skills, and learned to invest. My new job was in digital marketing, which opened my eyes to a different career path. I took online courses, devoured books, and hustled on the side. Bit by bit, I completely rebuilt my confidence. 5 years passed in a blur of hard work, hospital checkups, and careful planning. My remission held steady, and life blossomed in ways I never foresaw. I managed to buy a small condo, started consulting freelance, and built up a decent savings. I found a new girlfriend, Serena, but we took things slowly because I still carried emotional scars. She was gentle and kind, and I appreciated her patience. Everything was different from the life I had with Marisol, and that felt comforting. Though I rarely thought about my ex, I sometimes wondered what would happen if we crossed paths. Then, one ordinary afternoon, I walked into a convenience store to grab some snacks on my way home. I strolled toward the counter and nearly froze when I saw the cashier's face. It was Marisol. She looked different, older in a tired way. Her hair was shorter, and she wore a forced smile that vanished the moment she recognized me. My heart pounded, but not from longing. It felt like a well of bitterness had opened inside me. For a second, neither of us spoke. I half expected her to look away, but she just stared, waiting to see my reaction. I tried to appear calm, placing my items on the counter as though I were dealing with any other cashier. She started scanning them, her hands trembling slightly. She said, "Hey," in a quiet voice, like she wasn't sure if she had the right to speak to me. I responded with a neutral nod. Her eyes flickered with what looked like regret, or maybe shame. I noticed a cheap ring on her finger, but she wasn't wearing any other jewelry. I wondered how life had turned out for her since she abandoned me. Part of me felt grim satisfaction inside. She totaled the purchase and gave me the amount. I paid in cash, silently. My mind flashed back to a time when she asked me for money for groceries, claiming she was broke, and I willingly handed her my credit card. The irony was intense. I no longer had any desire to help her. In fact, I felt a surge of pride at how I'd managed without her. I almost wanted to say something biting, like, "You said my illness was too big for you to handle," but I kept quiet. There would be a better time for sweet revenge. As I turned to leave, she whispered my name. A small part of me wanted to ignore her, but curiosity got the better of me. I turned around and met her gaze. She looked like she wanted to apologize, but the words were stuck. Eventually, she muttered, "How have you been?" I didn't bother smiling. I just said, "I'm great," and left it at that. I saw her mouth open and close like she was struggling to find anything else to say. I picked up my bag, walked out the door, and felt a cascade of emotions flood my chest. I went home that day feeling victorious and unsettled at the same time. The shock of seeing her left me rattled, but I also felt a sense of validation. She had a mundane job while I'd reclaimed my life against all odds. It wasn't that being a cashier was shameful, but it was jarring to see her in such a different reality than the one she'd envisioned for herself. I remembered how she used to talk about moving to a big city, landing a high-paying job. She'd always said she deserved the best. Now, she was stuck behind a register. A week later, I decided to return to that store. I told myself I needed a soda, but deep down, I wanted to see if she was still there. Sure enough, she was at the same register, looking more drained than before. When she saw me, her face lit with a mixture of surprise and hesitation. I approached and placed my drink on the counter. She didn't speak until she handed me my change, then quietly asked if we could talk after her shift. Part of me wanted to storm out, but I smiled and said, "Sure." Revenge needed planning. I waited in my car across the lot. When she finally emerged, she looked nervous, like she wasn't sure I'd actually be there. She approached my window, and I stepped out, leaning against the hood. She apologized for everything that happened, saying she made a mistake leaving me. She admitted she'd thought she could do better. Apparently, after she left me, she moved in with some guy who turned out to be a gambler. He drained her savings and left her in debt. She tried to find better work, but without references or experience, she ended up at that register. I listened without a shred of sympathy. Then she said she'd heard I was doing well, that people told her I had a new career. She asked if I could help her out, maybe loan her some money, or put in a good word at my workplace. The audacity of it all was staggering. She deserted me when I was literally fighting for my life. Now she wanted my assistance. I stared at her face and recalled my nights alone, shivering from chemo. I could have unleashed my anger right then, but I decided to play it cool. I wanted more. So I told her I'd think about it. She sees that as a hopeful sign, giving me her phone number scribbled on a piece of paper. She asked me to call or text her anytime. I pocketed it, watching her eyes fill with gratitude. A calmness washed over me. I was in control. She was at my mercy. Part of me wondered if I should just toss the number in the trash and never speak to her again. But something in me wanted closure, and yes, revenge. I assured her I'd be in touch and got back in my car. I spent the next few days contemplating my next move. Serena noticed I was distracted and asked if something was wrong. I didn't mention Marisol at first, just said I was thinking about some career decisions. Finally, guilt weighed on me, and I told her about running into my ex. Serena was surprisingly supportive. She said she trusted me to handle it and that she hoped I could find peace. Her understanding reminded me why I deserved better than Marisol. My desire for revenge burned brighter. I wanted to show my ex that you can't just come back after betrayal. I texted Marisol and offered to meet at a quiet coffee shop. She showed up dressed better than before, maybe trying to impress me. She launched into a sob story about her life after she left me. I pretended to care, nodding and making sympathetic noises. She asked if there was any chance we could reconnect. Then she had the nerve to ask if I'd consider giving her a small loan to help her get back on her feet. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting her squirm. Instead of shutting her down immediately, I told her I'd think it over. She looked thrilled at my hesitation, probably assuming it meant I'd say yes. The truth was, I had no intention of handing her a dime, but I wanted her to hold on to that hope for a bit longer. I wanted her to realize how it felt to be the vulnerable one, uncertain and desperate. I kept my tone polite, asked questions about her situation, and watched her eyes light up whenever I seemed sympathetic. Inside, I felt cold satisfaction. This woman who once discarded me was now clinging to the possibility that I might rescue her. The tables had turned. After that meeting, she texted often. She'd tell me about job interviews that went nowhere, about her mounting bills. She hinted that she was about to be evicted. I responded sporadically, never fully committing to help. Part of me worried I was becoming cruel, but then I remembered the brutal loneliness I felt when she walked out. I pushed those doubts aside. Eventually, I told her I might have a lead on a job. She lit up at the idea. I explained it was a position with a friend's startup, one that offered decent pay and benefits. She practically begged. I arranged for her to meet my friend at a cafe. In truth, there was no friend, no actual job. I asked a former colleague to pose as a recruiter. He owed me a favor, so he agreed. Marisol arrived, and I watched from a distance. My colleague pretended to interview her, making her jump through hoops. She revealed all her desperation, saying she'd do whatever it took to succeed. When he brought up references, her face fell. Then he asked about her personal life. She tried to gloss over her past, presenting herself as someone who'd faced unfortunate circumstances. Afterward, my colleague gave me the details. He said she seemed willing to do anything for a second chance. He also mentioned that she was visibly embarrassed talking about her previous choices. He pretended to be on the fence and told her he'd call her later. When Marisol left, I thanked him and slipped him some cash for his trouble. It wasn't about tormenting her forever, but I wanted her to taste the anxiety she'd caused me. It felt petty, yet strangely liberating. I saw how powerless she really was, and for the first time, I felt genuinely at peace. But I wasn't done yet. I met her and said I decided not to give her the loan. I watched her face crumble. Then I dropped the bomb. I said my friend's startup had chosen someone else for the position. She begged me to reconsider, tears in her eyes. She said she was about to lose her apartment, that she had nowhere else to go. I reminded her how she had left me with nothing when I was at my worst. Her tears kept flowing, but I felt no pity. She made her bed, and now she lay in it. I could see the anger building behind her eyes. She probably expected me to cave in, to be the man she once knew, but I had become someone else, forged by pain and survival. I told her I hoped she learned something from this. She spit out a half-hearted apology, then demanded to know why I was being so cruel. I laughed at the irony. Cruel? She walked out on me when I was at death's door. She only showed up again because she needed something. I told her we were done, and I never wanted to see her face again. When I got home, I felt lighter. Serena noticed my mood and asked if I wanted to talk. I told her I'd finally cut ties with my ex for good. She gave me a concerned look, asking if I was okay. I told her I felt relieved, like I'd settled a debt. We spent the evening cooking dinner together, and for the first time in a while, my mind wasn't swirling with thoughts of revenge. I realized I didn't need to think about Marisol anymore. She was a chapter in my life that I'd chosen to close on my terms. A few months went by, and I heard rumors that Marisol had moved away. I didn't bother verifying. My job was going well. I even got a promotion that allowed me to travel. Serena and I grew closer, taking weekend trips and exploring each other's hobbies. One afternoon, while tidying up a closet, I found an old photo of Marisol and me, back when we thought we were invincible. I stared at it for a moment, then tore it up and tossed the pieces. I didn't feel sadness or regret, just a calm acceptance that I'd completely outgrown that painful chapter. I've come to realize that people who abandon you in your darkest times don't deserve a seat at your table when life improves. I didn't forgive Marisol, and I have no intention to. Forgiveness might be admirable, but some betrayals cut too deeply. I chose to heal without her, and I succeeded. Seeing her again and watching her struggle reminded me that karma can be ruthless. I'm not proud of every action I took, but I won't apologize for protecting myself. If she taught me anything, it's that self-respect is priceless, and that real love doesn't vanish when things get hard. In the end, I survived cancer, rebuilt my career, and found someone who truly cares for me. Marisol became just a footnote in my story, a cautionary tale about shallow loyalty. Sometimes I wonder if she regrets leaving when she did, but those thoughts no longer torment me. I have my health, my dignity, and a future full of possibilities. If I learned anything from that painful chapter, it's to absolutely never doubt my own worth. Life's too short to beg for someone's love, especially when they walked away the moment things got tough. I'll always stand firm in that conviction. I remember the day I first noticed something was off in my marriage. It was a Thursday morning, and I was sorting through our bills at the kitchen table. My wife, Lauren, was still asleep, so I was alone with the endless stream of statements and receipts. I typically left our finances on autopilot, trusting that we contributed equally and kept each other informed about any major expenses. But something about that morning made me dig deeper than usual. When I tried to reconcile my checking account with my credit card statements, there was an unsettling discrepancy. A few $1,000s had vanished, and I had no recollection of spending it. Concerned, but not yet alarmed, I assumed there might be an error in the bank's system or some oversight on my part. I never suspected Lauren could be responsible for that missing money. I began my investigation in a careful, methodical way. I printed copies of every transaction, highlighted anything I didn't recognize, and sorted them chronologically. One payment stood out immediately, a lump sum of $3,000 wired to an account I had never seen before. The transfer was labeled innocently enough, something about travel expenses, but I'd never authorized it, and neither had my bank flagged it as suspicious. My initial thought was that maybe Lauren booked something for the two of us, like a surprise vacation. She had teased me about wanting to take a real break somewhere out of town. However, she never mentioned spending thousands of dollars, and we normally communicated about big purchases. My gut twisted with worry. Still, I told myself there must be some rational explanation that had nothing to do with betrayal or lying. I confronted Lauren later that day. My approach was gentle at first. I told her I'd found a strange wire transfer labeled for travel, asked if she knew anything about it, and tried to read her reaction. She looked startled, but not in a guilty way, more like she was taken aback by my sudden interest in finances. She claimed she didn't recall any wire transfer of that size, suggested maybe the bank made a mistake, and offered to go with me to sort it out. Her calmness disarmed me, so I let it go for the moment. That evening, I watched her as we sat together on the couch, and everything seemed normal. She laughed at the same shows, scrolled her phone with the same bored expression, and even leaned on my shoulder like she always did. If she was hiding something, she played it convincingly. Over the next few days, I tried not to obsess about that transfer, but I couldn't help myself. Every time Lauren left the house, I found myself sneaking a look at her laptop or searching through receipts in the trash. I felt like a detective, and it was exhausting. I discovered small clues that began to fit together in a disturbing pattern. A receipt for a fancy hotel in Miami, a suspicious email confirming an airline reservation, and an unusual text message notification that popped up on her phone. I didn't get a full look at the message, but the words, "Can't wait to see you," were enough to set my heart racing. I wasn't ready to confront her without proof, but my suspicions grew stronger by the hour. It felt like my entire marriage was balancing on a cliff, and I was terrified of what lay below. Eventually, I did something I'm not proud of. I installed spyware on her phone. It felt invasive and immoral, but I had to confirm what was really happening. Within days, I found exactly what I feared: messages between Lauren and a man named Eric. They'd been carrying on what seemed like a full-blown affair for months, sharing their fantasies, complaining about me, and planning a secret trip. I felt nauseated reading the details. She had used my money to book a luxurious getaway for the two of them. The date was approaching in just a week, and she'd planned to tell me she was going on a work retreat with colleagues. I was furious and heartbroken all at once. Part of me wanted to confront her instantly, but another part wanted to play it smart, gather more evidence, and ensure I had a strategy that would truly protect my interests. I decided to consult a lawyer. I knew that confronting Lauren without a legal safety net could backfire. During my lunch break, I visited a local family law attorney who specialized in divorce and financial disputes. I brought a folder of documents and the screenshots from her messages. He listened carefully, nodding as I explained the situation. Then he laid out my options. I could file for divorce immediately, freeze joint accounts, and potentially sue for the stolen money. Alternatively, I could gather more evidence, wait until Lauren actually took the trip, and then catch her in the act. He warned me about the emotional toll of each choice, but I was fixated on the sense of betrayal pulsing through my veins. Part of me just wanted revenge. I wanted her to experience the same feeling of shock and humiliation she had inflicted on me. I went home that night and pretended everything was normal. Lauren told me she had an upcoming work trip, and I played along. asking the usual questions about her itinerary. She seemed relieved by my nonchalance. Meanwhile, I quietly transferred most of our joint savings into a new account under my name only. I left enough funds behind to keep appearances, but not enough for her to pull another stunt. I also started separating key financial documents, removing my name from any shared bills that I could. It was a slow process, but it felt oddly empowering. Each step was a reminder that I would no longer be her fool. Whenever she smiled at me with that faux warmth, I smiled back, knowing I had the upper hand. It was unsettling how easily I slipped into deception, but I felt she deserved nothing less. The day before her supposed work trip, she was busy packing. I peeked into the bedroom and watched her fold clothes I'd never seen before, items too casual and beachy for a professional conference. She noticed me lurking, so I quickly asked if she needed help, playing the role of concerned husband. She smiled, said she was fine, and continued. I could feel my blood boiling, but I maintained a calm demeanor, telling her I had to step out for some errands. In truth, I was heading to the bank to finalize a freeze on the credit card she typically used. I would let her board that plane and check into her hotel with Eric, only to find her card declined when she tried to charge the room. It was petty, but it was the only way I knew how to show her that I wasn't a doormat. The morning of her flight, she left the house with a quick kiss on my cheek, saying she'd call me once she landed. I said, "Have a great trip," and forced a smile. The moment she was gone, I called my lawyer, letting him know she was en route. He advised me to stay calm and follow through with our plan. I spent the day pacing, unable to focus on anything else. Around midday, I got a text from Lauren's phone saying her flight was delayed. She sounded annoyed, but it was impossible for me to feel sympathy. I knew exactly why she was truly annoyed. She wanted to meet up with Eric as soon as possible. I tried not to imagine them together, but the images flooded my mind anyway. Every second felt like a fresh betrayal. Rage simmered beneath my composure, but I kept reminding myself that my plan was in motion. She finally arrived at her hotel sometime that evening. I waited anxiously for any update. Right on schedule, around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Lauren. "Made it, super tired, going to bed early." I almost laughed at the audacity. I knew from her messages with Eric that they intended to meet in the bar around that time. A few minutes later, I logged into the credit card account to check if any charges had been attempted. Sure enough, there was a decline at the hotel's front desk. My heart pounded with dark satisfaction. I pictured her confusion, maybe even a flicker of terror that I'd discovered everything. But as gratifying as it felt, I also felt the weight of sadness. This was the woman I once loved, and now I was orchestrating her downfall. It was a strange mixture of triumph and regret. Curiosity ate at me, and I opened the spyware dashboard to see if she was messaging Eric about the declined card. The conversation was raging. She was panicking, accusing the bank of incompetence, and claiming she had no idea why the card wouldn't work. Eric was urging her to call me and sort it out. She hesitated, probably afraid to blow her cover. Finally, she texted me, "Hey, having some issues with the card, could you call the bank?" I waited a good 10 minutes before responding with a single line, "I'll look into it tomorrow." That must have driven her nuts. I imagined them stuck at the front desk, forced to use Eric's card instead. Their romantic weekend was already tainted by stress. I took a grim sort of pleasure in it, though a small part of me felt disgusted by how vengeful I'd become. The next morning, I messaged her back, claiming the bank had told me there was suspected fraud and the account was temporarily frozen. She kept insisting she needed me to fix it immediately, and I played dumb, saying I would handle it on Monday. Meanwhile, I continued checking the spyware. She was furious, venting to Eric that I was useless and that this was the last thing she needed. He tried to reassure her, but it was clear he was annoyed about footing the bills. I wondered how deep his pockets were and whether he'd think twice about continuing the affair if it meant covering every expense. I felt a grim satisfaction imagining their arguments. It was a twisted scenario, but I couldn't deny a certain sense of justice. After all, she was the one who had stolen from me and lied to my face. I refused to bail her out, not after she'd betrayed me so thoroughly. By Saturday evening, they'd managed to check into the room, presumably using Eric's card. The phone calls from Lauren became less frequent, replaced by short, clipped texts. She tried to maintain the facade, mentioning how exhausted she was from all the workshops. I responded politely but never addressed the card issue. Despite my anger, I felt a pang of heartbreak imagining her in another man's arms. Still, that bitterness fueled my resolve. I spent the weekend finalizing paperwork for the divorce. My lawyer sent me drafts to review, and I made sure to include a clause demanding full reimbursement of the stolen money. Part of me wanted to expose her publicly, but I also wanted to protect myself from any countersuits. My lawyer reminded me that discreet action was often the most powerful. Let her dig her own grave, he said, and then present the evidence when it matters most. When she returned home on Sunday night, I was in the kitchen, casually sipping a beer. She walked in with her suitcase and the usual forced smile, but I could sense her tension. We exchanged pleasantries, and she quickly headed to take a shower. I knew she wanted to avoid any conversation about the trip. She emerged later in pajamas, hair damp, and sat across from me at the dining table. Her eyes flickered with nervous energy, but she tried to act normal, asking about my weekend. I kept my responses brief, not giving her any opening to question me. Finally, she tried to address the credit card issue, saying she'd talked to the bank herself and claimed it was some mix-up. I pretended to believe her, acting relieved that everything was resolved. Deep down, I was already envisioning the moment I would unleash everything I knew. I just needed the final pieces to fall into place. The next few days were agonizing. Every time I saw her, I felt a wave of anger mixed with sadness. She acted as if nothing happened, occasionally dropping hints about how stressful the work retreat had been. I nodded along, fighting the urge to scream. Meanwhile, I coordinated with my lawyer to set a date to serve her the divorce papers. He suggested waiting until Friday afternoon so she'd have the weekend to process the shock. I agreed, though the waiting tested my patience. I spent my evenings compiling every piece of evidence: the wire transfer details, the screenshots of her messages with Eric, the receipts for the hotel, and the phone logs that proved she'd lied. Each document was a reminder of how deeply she'd betrayed me. There was no going back to normal after this. I was done playing the forgiving spouse. Friday arrived, and my nerves were on edge all morning. Lauren left for work without suspecting a thing. I'd arranged for a process server to meet her at home that afternoon, just as she returned. She usually got back around 5, so I made sure to clear my schedule. I waited in the living room, imagining the look on her face when she'd find a stranger on our doorstep, handing her the papers that signaled the end of our marriage. The hours ticked by slowly. Around 4:30, I received a text from her saying she'd be working late. My heart sank, worried she might not come home until much later, complicating my plan. But the process server reassured me he could wait. At 6:15, her car pulled into the driveway. I peeked through the curtain, my pulse hammering in my ears as I saw the server approach her. She walked in a few minutes later, pale and visibly rattled. Her hands shook as she clutched the envelope. I stood up, and we locked eyes. For a brief moment, she looked like a stranger to me, someone I used to know but had changed beyond recognition. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Finally, she managed to whisper, "You're divorcing me?" I nodded, crossing my arms. She stared at the papers, flipping through the pages that detailed her betrayal, the stolen money, the affair with Eric. Her face crumpled with shame and anger. She tried to throw the papers on the floor, but she was too shaky to make it dramatic. I watched her crumble right there in our living room. That's when she started screaming, accusations, denials, every excuse in the book. I didn't flinch, just stood there, arms crossed, letting her unravel. She begged me to reconsider, claimed it was a one-time mistake, that she'd been lonely, that I'd driven her into Eric's arms. She accused me of neglect, of working too much, of failing to understand her emotional needs. I listened in silence, but my mind was made up. I had read the messages, seen her plan the trip, watched her lie to my face without hesitation. Nothing she said could erase the cold reality of what she'd done. I told her I wanted her out of the house by the end of the month, that I'd already moved most of our money and closed our joint accounts. The look of betrayal on her face almost made me laugh. How ironic that she felt betrayed by me now. She shouted some more, threatened she'd fight me in court. I simply responded, "Do what you need to do." In the weeks that followed, she tried various tactics to win me back or intimidate me into dropping the divorce. She left tearful voicemails, wrote letters apologizing and claiming she'd always loved me. Then she swung to anger, hiring her own lawyer and vowing to take everything she could. I met each maneuver with calm determination. My own lawyer was well prepared. We had the evidence of her affair, the financial misdeeds, and even her written confession in text messages. Lauren's threats didn't stand a chance. Meanwhile, Eric seemingly dropped out of the picture. From what I gathered, he didn't want the drama or the potential financial burden. She ended up alone, scrambling to find a place to live and trying to salvage her reputation among our friends. Some turned against her once they learned the truth. Others pitied her. I felt neither pity nor sympathy. She'd sown these seeds of deceit, and now she was forced to reap the bitter harvest. In the end, the divorce was granted swiftly. The court ordered her to repay the money she had stolen, and she lost any claim to spousal support. Her job found out about the deceit after a coworker saw the legal papers, and management quietly let her go soon after. I heard she spent a few months couch surfing, struggling to piece her life together. Every so often, I'd receive a pathetic text from her, asking for another chance, or cursing me for ruining her life. I never responded. I'd already made my choice. Karma had a way of catching up with her without me lifting a finger. My revenge was complete, and there was nothing left to say. I walked away from that chapter of my life with my head held high, determined never to repeat those mistakes. Some people might expect a moral about forgiveness, but I found none. Betrayal was a line she chose to cross, and I chose to let her drown in the consequences. And that, I believe, is the only justice she ever truly deserved. I'll never forget the day my parents told me to pack up and get out. I was 16, barely old enough to figure out how to survive on my own. But there I was, holding a small backpack stuffed with clothes and a couple of personal items. We lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town. My dad's voice had been icy, and my mom just stood behind him with arms folded across her chest. No tears, no sign of regret. They said they were done dealing with my attitude. Looking back, I was a rebellious teenager, but it wasn't like I was a criminal. I was just mouthy. I had an opinion, and I refused to back down, especially when I knew something wasn't fair. My parents never liked that. They always preferred my older sister, who was perfectly obedient, always doing what they wanted without complaint. For me, the day they kicked me out is burned into my memory because it was the moment I realized I was completely on my own. Nobody was going to help me, not even the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. That realization cut deeper than insults could. I was in shock at first, wandering around with nowhere to go. My best friend's parents agreed to let me crash in their basement for a couple of weeks, but I could sense their unease. They had bills and responsibilities, and a mouthy teenage house guest wasn't exactly on their wish list. I tried to be helpful by cleaning up and babysitting their younger kids, but that short stay only reinforced that I needed my own place. I knew I couldn't stay in school if I was going to make rent, so I dropped out. That decision still haunts me sometimes, but back then, surviving felt like the only priority. One afternoon, I lied about my age and got a part-time job washing dishes at a diner. The pay was horrible, but it was a start. I moved into the cheapest room I could find, a place where the walls were so thin I heard everything happening next door. It was humiliating to live that way, but I had no real choice. I taught myself how to budget every penny. A single slip could mean I'd be out on the streets. I felt abandoned and furious, but I refused to break. As the months went by, I learned hard lessons that most teenagers don't face until later. I figured out how to fake a smile at customers so my boss wouldn't fire me. I learned how to eat cheaply, filling up on bread and ramen noodles. I spent my rare free hours looking for better-paying jobs, but no one wanted to hire a dropout with no experience. My old friends stayed in school, going to dances and football games, while I spent evenings scrubbing plates and wiping counters. I didn't envy them, I just realized I was living an entirely different life. My parents didn't call once. There was no check-in to see if I was okay. It was like I never existed. I channeled my anger into working as many hours as I could. Over time, I stumbled on a flyer for a construction laborer position that paid more than the diner. I fibbed about my age again and started hauling materials on a job site. It was backbreaking work, but I was grateful for the higher wage. At 16, I was paying rent and utility bills all on my own, fueled by sheer resentment and desperation. I felt unstoppable. After a year of working construction, I learned the value of discipline. Waking up before dawn, enduring the scorching sun or freezing wind, and pushing my body to its limits showed me that I was capable of more than I ever imagined. I saved up every extra dollar I could, determined to escape my dingy room. Some nights, I lay awake feeling hatred toward my parents. I resented them for ignoring me, for making me feel worthless and disposable. But I refused to let that define me forever. Around that time, I met someone who ran a small landscaping company. He offered me weekend work, planting shrubs and mowing lawns. It didn't pay much more, but it gave me fresh air and a chance to learn new skills. I was 17 by then, still underage, still without a high school diploma, but I felt like a grown adult in every sense. At the end of every shift, I tucked away part of my paycheck in an envelope marked Future. I wasn't sure what my future held, but I wanted to be ready. That's what I told myself whenever doubts crept in late at night. I refused to be completely broken. When I turned 18, I felt a strange mix of pride and bitterness. I was officially an adult, but it had been years since I'd really felt like a kid. I decided to get my GED so I could at least have something to show for my education. It turned out I was pretty decent at studying when I set my mind to it. Balancing work and classes was tough, but I passed the exams. I remember walking out of the testing center with tears in my eyes, not because I was overjoyed, but because I realized my parents never even witnessed this achievement. They had no idea what I'd gone through. I told myself that was fine. I didn't need their approval. After that, I started looking for trade programs. College seemed out of reach financially, but I discovered a local community college that offered a 2-year welding course. The idea of working with my hands, manipulating metal into something functional and strong, appealed to me. I took a leap and fully enrolled, scraping together financial aid forms and scholarship applications. It felt like the first step towards something bigger, like I was finally claiming my life for myself. Welding school was an entirely different world. Most of my classmates were older, juggling families and other responsibilities. I felt out of place at first, but at least nobody looked down on me for being there. We were all trying to learn a trade that could pay the bills. I dove in with everything I had, practicing welds until my arms ached. The instructors noticed my dedication and started recommending me for odd jobs around campus. I fixed gates, patched up metal fixtures, and even helped build a sculpture for an art student. Each time, I earned a little money and a lot of respect. It was the first time I felt like I was good at something that mattered. During that period, I kept my emotions about my family locked away. I had no contact with them, and they never tried to reach me. I stopped dreaming they'd show up to congratulate me or even apologize. My focus was on self-improvement and forging my own path. By the end of the 2-year program, I had more confidence than I ever thought possible. I landed an entry-level welding position at a local shop, ready to start the next chapter. Hopeful. The welding shop was small, but the owner had big ambitions. He liked my work ethic and gave me increasingly challenging projects. Before long, I was fabricating custom railings, decorative gates, and even some artistic pieces for upscale clients. The pay was decent, not amazing, but enough to upgrade my living situation to a tiny studio apartment. It felt incredible to have a space that was truly my own, even if it was just one room with a kitchenette. That sense of independence fueled me to work harder. Around that time, I discovered that I had a knack for building relationships with clients. I listened to what they wanted, suggested practical design tweaks, and delivered on time. Word of mouth spread, and people started asking for me by name. My boss noticed the uptick in business and gave me a small raise. That was enough to motivate me to think bigger. I asked him if he'd consider branching out and taking on more specialized jobs, but he was set in his ways. I got the sense that I'd hit a ceiling there. Still, I owed the place a lot. It was where I learned how to blend skill with ambition. I started doing side gigs whenever I had free time. At first, it was just repairing broken fences or welding small projects for neighbors. But word spread quickly that I was reliable, affordable, and detail-oriented. I realized I could grow this into something more substantial. I rented a corner in a friend's garage, bought a second-hand welding machine, and set up my own mini workshop. Within a few months, I had enough regular clients that I felt confident giving my notice at the shop. My boss wished me luck, but also seemed a bit miffed. I can't blame him. I was leaving to become his potential competitor. Still, I tried to keep things cordial. My new business grew in fits and starts. Some weeks, I had more orders than I could handle. Other times, I struggled to find clients, but I made a point of never turning away an opportunity to learn. If someone wanted a type of work I wasn't experienced in, I researched, practiced, and figured it out. Slowly, the profit margins began to inch up. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was doing better than I'd ever done before, and it felt like real progress. Finally, as my client list expanded, I started taking on bigger projects. I welded steel frameworks for custom furniture, built elaborate gates for wealthy homeowners, and even contributed to a few public art installations. I'd never forgotten the struggle of being homeless at 16, so I donated scraps and leftover materials to local trade school students whenever I could. It felt like a small way of paying it forward. Money was still tight, but I upgraded my garage space to a legit workshop, complete with better tools and a small office area. By the time I was 23, I had 2 employees, another welder and an assistant who handled scheduling and billing. It amazed me to see how far I'd come. Even so, there was still this deep-rooted anger in me. I kept telling myself I'd gotten over my parents' betrayal, but the truth was, I was using that resentment as fuel. Every time I thought about quitting, I remembered the day they threw me out. It reminded me that I could rely on no one but myself. Oddly enough, that dark motivation worked. My business thrived, and with each year, I saw my savings account grow. Success tasted like justice. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from my mother. I was 25 at that point, and it had been nearly a decade since we'd last spoken. She reached out via social media, claiming she missed me and wanted to catch up. I'll admit, my heart pounded when I saw her name pop up. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me. I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She said she and my father had fallen on hard times and needed a little financial help. After all, they'd raised me, hadn't they? I was furious. These people who threw me out when I was 16 had the audacity to demand money from me because I was now doing well. I felt the old anger flare up, but I tried to keep it cool. I asked for more details, wanting to see just how far they'd go. My mother painted a sob story about my father losing his job and my sister refusing to help. She implied that I owed them for the years of feeding and housing me. I nearly laughed at the irony. They wanted me to save them after discarding me. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to process everything. Memories came flooding back of sleeping on my friend's basement couch and scraping by on diner wages. I recalled the heartbreak of realizing my own parents didn't give a damn about me. Now they were showing up like it was all water under the bridge, expecting me to dig into my wallet just because we shared DNA. Part of me wanted to tell them to go to hell and block them forever. Another part was curious to see how they'd react if I toyed with them a bit. So I messaged back, asking how much they needed. My mother was quick to quote a figure that was no small sum. I told her I'd think about it, which led to her bombarding me with messages about how family should help family. The hypocrisy was almost comical. At that point, I made up my mind. If they were willing to treat me like a walking bank, then maybe I'd play along, but on my terms. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. I wanted them to understand exactly what they had lost when they tossed me aside. And I wanted a little payback. First, I arranged a meeting at a coffee shop in my old hometown. I wanted to see their faces when I walked in, dressed sharply and clearly well off. The moment they saw me, I sensed their surprise. My father tried to mask it behind a weak smile, while my mother acted overly familiar, calling me sweetie, like nothing had happened. I let them ramble about their struggles, nodding sympathetically but keeping my guard up. Their story was predictable: medical bills, job loss, overdue mortgage payments. Apparently, my sister had cut ties with them after some argument. It was almost funny that the daughter they favored was gone, and the one they threw out was now their best hope. My father looked at me expectantly, like I was an ATM. I asked how they planned to pay me back, or if they even intended to. They exchanged awkward glances, insisting they just needed a temporary boost. I forced a gentle smile and told them I'd help, on one condition: they'd sign a legal document acknowledging the debt. They hesitated, but desperation won. We agreed to meet again in a few days. I left that coffee shop feeling a sense of triumph. Over the next few days, I had my lawyer draft an agreement stating that I would loan my parents a specific amount. They would pay it back with reasonable interest. If they failed to meet the terms, I could claim certain assets. essentially the small house they still owned. It was a brutal clause, but I didn't care. They'd thrown me out on the streets with no safety net. Why should I offer them a cushion? My lawyer warned me that it was an extreme measure, but I told him I wanted it in there. My parents probably assumed I'd never enforce it, but I intended to do exactly that if they tried to exploit me again. On the day of our second meeting, they arrived looking anxious. I presented the contract and explained the terms. They balked at first, asking why I couldn't just give them the money. I shrugged and said that nobody ever gave me anything for free. Their guilt was obvious, but they signed. I handed them a check, and for a moment, they actually looked relieved. My father even tried to hug me, but I stepped back. This wasn't reconciliation. It was business, pure and simple. They made a few payments over the next year, but it was clear they couldn't keep up. My mother called me one day, sobbing about how they were in danger of losing the house. She pleaded for more time or a reduction in interest. I was conflicted. Part of me remembered being that scared teenager with no place to go, wishing someone would show compassion. But then I thought about all the times I'd cried alone, feeling abandoned and worthless because of their actions. This was the moment to decide who I really was. I told her coldly that a contract was a contract. If they couldn't fulfill it, I would seize their property. She begged, saying they had nowhere else to live. I reminded her that neither did I when they kicked me out at 16. Her tears turned into anger, and she spat accusations, calling me ungrateful. That only cemented my resolve. I ended the call and told my lawyer to begin proceedings. It took several months of legal wrangling, but eventually, the house was mine. My parents were forced to move into a cramped apartment. I didn't feel guilty. I felt like justice had finally been served. After all was said and done, I decided to sell that house. I had no sentimental attachment to it. The profit from the sale was substantial enough to expand my welding business into a full-fledged metal fabrication company. We specialized in high-end custom work, and eventually, we landed contracts with architectural firms. Now, at 28, I employ a dozen people, own a thriving business, and have a comfortable life. My parents exist somewhere in the same city, but we haven't spoken since the day they lost the house. Sometimes I wonder if I went too far, but then I remember that 16th birthday when I was thrown out like garbage. They never showed me mercy. Why should I offer them any? It's not a fairy tale ending where everybody hugs and makes up. It's real life, and justice is the closest thing to closure you can get. I keep my circle small, treasuring the people who stood by me when I had nothing. My parents aren't part of that circle. No amount of money or guilt tripping will change what happened. I carved out my own path and took what I was owed. That, to me, is enough. I rest easy. I remember the day I realized my family wasn't as perfect as I had always believed. Growing up, I had a straightforward dream. Graduate high school with good grades, work part-time to save money, and eventually enroll in a culinary arts program. I'd always loved cooking, but my parents viewed it as an impractical career path. Still, I spent my time waiting tables at a local diner, squirreling away every tip and every paycheck. My manager recognized my diligence, so he gave me the night shifts, where I could earn a bit more. Over 3 years, I managed to set aside a decent sum. The plan was simple: pay for the college application process and any initial costs not covered by financial aid. I knew it wouldn't cover everything, but it was a start. The last thing I expected was to come home one day and discover that my college fund had been emptied by the very people I trusted most, my parents. Even worse, I learned they used the money to bail out my younger sister, who had racked up an enormous credit card debt without so much as a second thought. She was always the favorite, and everyone knew it, but I never imagined they'd go this far. I stared at my empty savings account, numb with shock. My mind raced with questions. How could they do this to me? How long had they been planning it? Did they even care about my plans, my future? I was 18, graduated, and I had just discovered that every late shift and weekend I'd spent hustling was for nothing. But my parents acted like it was no big deal. They said it was necessary because my sister was in trouble, and family helps family. I felt betrayal swelling in my chest. I confronted my parents that night, demanding an explanation. They claimed they planned to pay me back once my sister got on her feet. But I knew that was a lie. My sister had never been responsible. She was the type to blow cash on designer shoes, weekend getaways, and pricey electronics she barely used. She never kept a job for more than a month, claiming she was too creative for mundane work. Whenever she had a problem, my parents swooped in to rescue her. This time, though, they decided to use the money I'd sacrificed for. I lost my temper, shouting at them in a way I never had before. My father demanded I apologize for my disrespect, but I refused. The entire time, my sister stayed locked in her room, probably grateful she didn't have to answer for her spending. I felt such a raw fury that my hands shook. The worst part was realizing they saw nothing wrong in what they did. My mother kept insisting we were a family and that I should grow up and get over it. She even tried to guilt trip me by saying, "If you can't help your sister, what kind of person are you?" That stung because up until that point, I'd always believed that I was a caring sibling. But I also recognized that helping someone shouldn't come at the cost of betraying another family member's trust. My anger made me say things I never thought I would say to them. I told them I hated them for stealing my future. The shock on my father's face was apparent, but neither he nor my mother offered an apology. Instead, they dug in their heels, convinced they were right, and I needed to accept it. I refused to let it go. I left the house that night and slept in my car, too angry to face them. The next day, I contacted the bank to see if there was any way to reverse the transfer. No luck. Since my parents had joint access to the account, the bank wouldn't do anything. It felt like I was stuck in a nightmare, but I refused to be a victim. I decided to stay with a coworker for a while, someone who offered me a couch to crash on. My parents kept blowing up my phone, demanding I come home and talk it out, but I wasn't ready. Whenever I looked at my phone and saw their names, my blood boiled. I knew they were probably worried about how it would look to the neighbors if I suddenly vanished. That had always been my parents' biggest concern, appearances. They spent years bragging about my sister's non-existent talents or about our picture-perfect family dynamic. Underneath that facade, though, was a toxic pattern of enabling my sister and dismissing me. The betrayal was so deep that I felt something inside me snap. I resolved never to forgive them. I wanted revenge, but I had to be smart about it. I couldn't just vandalize their property or scream at them in public. That would only confirm their narrative that I was the ungrateful, disrespectful child. Instead, I needed to plan my moves carefully. I started by collecting every bit of evidence I could, screenshots of the bank transfers, text messages, whatever I had. Then I began talking to close friends, letting them know the truth so my parents couldn't twist the story. If they wanted a war, I'd give them one, but on my terms, with a calm I had never shown before. I would protect myself relentlessly now. I decided to enroll in community college first. It was cheaper, closer, and I could pay course by course. I knew it wasn't my dream culinary program, but at least I could keep moving forward. Meanwhile, I took on more hours at the diner, plus a second job on weekends as a caterer's assistant. It was backbreaking, but I refused to let their betrayal derail my goals. I was also determined to show them I could succeed without their help. In the months that followed, I barely spoke to my parents. My mother would leave voicemails begging me to be reasonable, but I always deleted them. She never admitted any wrongdoing. My sister sent me a text once stating, "Sorry if you're upset, but I needed the money more than you." She didn't even try to hide her entitlement. That text was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I realized I didn't just want distance from them, I wanted justice. So, I did some research on small claims court. If I could prove they took the money without my permission, I might have a case. But the legal fees and the complexity of suing my own parents felt overwhelming. Instead, I decided on another route. I reached out to extended family members, people who had always suspected my parents' favoritism but never had concrete proof. I told them what happened, showed them the bank statements, and let them form their own conclusions. Over time, I watched as my aunts, uncles, and cousins distanced themselves from my parents. They stopped inviting them to family gatherings, stopped calling them regularly, and my parents began to sense the shift. The wedge had been driven, not by me, but by their own actions. They started to lose their social standing, their cultivated facade. Over the next year, I managed to save a bit of money again. I was juggling classes, jobs, and a simmering rage that never really went away. My parents tried sending me birthday gifts and holiday cards with half-hearted apologies written inside. I threw them all in the trash. I knew what they wanted. a quick fix, a hollow reconciliation that would allow them to pretend nothing ever happened. That wasn't an option. Every day, I reminded myself that I deserved better than the family I was stuck with. My sister, on the other hand, continued her cycle of bad financial decisions. She bought a new car on an expensive lease and kept borrowing more. It was only a matter of time before she ran into serious trouble again. And I was waiting. I heard through the family grapevine that my sister had co-signed a friend's loan and gotten burned. I wasn't surprised. Her friend defaulted, leaving her with an additional debt she couldn't handle. My parents were frantic, but by then, many relatives had distanced themselves, and nobody wanted to lend her money. Eventually, my mother tried to reach out, claiming she wanted to talk things over and see if I could help. That was the moment I knew payback was within reach. I agreed to meet them, but only in a public place, a coffee shop near my community college. When I arrived, they looked tired, older, and more fragile. My father tried to make small talk, but I cut him off. I told them they were reaping what they'd sown. If they expected me to bail out my sister, they were delusional. The shock and disappointment on their faces was almost satisfying. But I didn't leave it at that. I told them I had a plan. For everything. They looked intrigued and uneasy. My father shifted in his seat, asking what I meant. I calmly explained that since they robbed me of my education fund, they could pay me back by selling some of their possessions or taking out a loan. I said it as if it were the most logical solution in the world. My mother balked, claiming they couldn't afford to pay me back right now. I reminded her that they had enough to cover my sister's debts without hesitation, so maybe they could get creative for my sake. The irony was clear. They expected me to help them fix my sister's new mess, but they had no plan to reimburse me for the money they'd stolen. My father tried to deflect, saying I was being vindictive. I didn't deny it. I told them I had no intention of forgiving them for what they did. My sister owed thousands again, and they were in a panic because no one wanted to bail her out this time. I made it clear that the only way I'd consider speaking to them again was if I saw an effort to repay me. If they sold their car, their jewelry, or dipped into their retirement, whatever it took. Otherwise, we had nothing more to discuss. My mother started crying, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no sadness. After all, she'd watched me cry when I discovered what they did, and she felt nothing then. My father's face was set in anger, but he remained silent. The coffee shop was bustling around us, but in that moment it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the three of us. I calmly stood up, told them to call me when they had a real plan, and walked out without looking back. At first, I doubted they would ever pay me back. They were too stubborn, too locked into their belief that I owed them my loyalty no matter what. But time has a way of humbling people, especially when their favorite child becomes a financial black hole. My sister's debts spiraled. She almost lost her car, defaulted on another credit card, and then lost her job. By the time she tried to apply for any assistance, her credit score was ruined. My parents were watching their retirement evaporate in real time. They tried to shield her, even covering some of her overdue bills, but it was never enough. Eventually, my aunt told me that my parents had started selling off furniture and other items. They put their house on the market, hoping to downsize and free up some money. Part of me was astonished they'd go that far, but another part felt a satisfaction. The day finally came when my father called, saying they could pay me a portion of what they owed. He asked if that would be enough to open a conversation. I told him not to bother unless he had the entire amount. A week later, I got a text from my mother. She said they had sold their house and were prepared to pay me back in full, plus extra for interest. She pleaded with me to speak to my sister, who was going through a difficult time. I agreed to meet them again, but made it clear my sister wasn't part of the deal. We met in a lawyer's office, a neutral ground. They handed me a cashier's check for the amount they took, plus 10% more. I stared at that check, remembering how many hours I worked for every dollar. I didn't smile. My parents tried to give some speech about how they hoped this would mend our family. I shut that down immediately. The lawyer they'd hired asked if I wanted to sign anything indicating I had been repaid in full. I said yes, as long as it was clear I wasn't relinquishing any legal rights regarding potential emotional damages. That rattled them, but they agreed. My mother kept eyeing me like she wanted to hug me or apologize, but no words came. My father seemed older than I ever remembered, like the weight of their actions had finally crushed him. I wanted to feel pity, but all I felt was anger cooled into resolve. They walked out of that office looking defeated. I took one last glance at them before heading in the opposite direction. I'd recovered my stolen money, but the scars they'd left behind weren't so easily erased. The next day, my sister called me from a blocked number. She begged me to lend her just enough to cover her car payments. I refused outright, telling her she needed to deal with her own mess. She accused me of being cruel, said I was punishing her for something our parents did. I reminded her of that text she sent, the one where she said she needed the money more than I did. Then I hung up. Weeks went by, and I learned she moved back in with our parents, except now they were living in a smaller condo with far less disposable income. In the end, they all found themselves in a cramped space, financially strained, and stuck with each other. I felt no obligation to rescue any of them. People said I should try to reconcile, that life is short, but my pride wouldn't let me. I'd had enough. As I continued my studies, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My finances weren't abundant, but I finally had the money that was rightfully mine, and I could plan my future on my own terms. My parents tried one more time to contact me, sending a long letter about how they had made mistakes, that they hoped to see me at the holidays. I read it once and tossed it. My life was moving forward, and I didn't need to burden myself with their guilt. Friends told me I might regret cutting them off one day, that perhaps I'd want my parents in my life if I ever had kids. I considered that possibility, but it didn't change how I felt. Trust, once shattered, doesn't magically reassemble. I wasn't about to pretend for their sake. My sister sent occasional messages, always about how hard her life had become, how she missed the old days. I never responded. I had no desire to revisit the old days where I was the family's ignored workhorse. My own journey was more important now. I started taking advanced courses, found a culinary mentor, and even competed in a small cooking contest sponsored by a local restaurant association. I didn't win first place, but I got a foot in the door. A respected chef noticed my determination and offered me a part-time position at his restaurant. It felt like everything was finally aligning. I never told my parents about these successes. They'd lost the right to share in my accomplishments the day they stole from me. Revenge isn't always a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it's living well while those who wronged you watch from the sidelines. I felt vindicated every time I hit a new milestone they would never celebrate with me. Pure satisfaction. In the end, I realized that revenge doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's quiet and resolute. My parents lost their home, their savings, and the respect of most of our extended family. My sister lost her safety net and had to confront the reality of her poor decisions. I gained a sense of freedom I never knew I was missing. Yes, I got my money back, but more than that, I got my dignity back. I will never forget the betrayal, nor will I forgive it. When people ask about my family, I say as little as possible. They're not a chapter I enjoy revisiting. I've done well for myself since then. I completed my community college program, saved enough to transfer to a reputable culinary institute, and have been working part-time at a restaurant where I'm learning more than I ever imagined. I've moved into a small apartment of my own, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Every time I unlock that door after a long shift, I feel a surge of pride. I earned this life on my own terms. Sometimes I see old photos of my parents and me back when I still believed we were a normal family. I get a pang of sadness, but it disappears quickly. Their choice to steal from me and finance my sister's laziness sealed our fate. Some might call me heartless for refusing to mend fences. I call it self-preservation. I've come too far to let them hurt me again. Now, when people talk about the importance of family, I quietly remember how mine betrayed me. Not all families are built the same, and not all wounds can heal. And that's okay. I found my own way without them, and that will always be the sweetest revenge. Final justice was mine. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation where my marriage was crumbling due to something as cliched as infidelity. But life has a way of throwing punches when you least expect it. I met Kara when we were in college, and she was everything I could have wanted. Vibrant, ambitious, and someone who pushed me to succeed. Over the years, we built a life together, or so I believed. I started my own consulting firm, and she pursued a career in marketing before deciding to shift her focus to fitness. At first, I supported her new passion wholeheartedly. When she began training with a personal coach at a local gym, I even offered to cover the costs, believing it was an investment in her well-being. I was working long hours, but I assumed she appreciated my efforts. Never did it cross my mind that she might be looking elsewhere for more than just a fitness regimen. Yet here I am, standing in the aftermath of her betrayal, replaying every lie she told me when she came home late so frequently. The irony is that she blamed me for being absent, as if my hard work was the problem. I remember the day it all came crashing down. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I'd gone to the gym to surprise Kara with lunch. I wanted to show her I cared, that even though I was busy, I could make time for her. I spotted her near the free weights, standing too close to her personal trainer. The look they exchanged made my stomach twist. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling, but when I approached them, their startled expressions told me I'd just barged in on something private. She was stammering through an introduction, and he seemed uncomfortable. I left without making a scene, determined to believe it was just paranoia on my part. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Later that night, I checked her phone while she was in the shower, an act I still feel guilty about. The messages I found confirmed my worst fears. Explicit exchanges, pictures in that encounter, and an undeniable emotional bond. My heart sank as I realized she had crossed a line that neither of us could ever come back from. That was the moment everything shifted. My trust in her, once unwavering, dissolved in an instant. I confronted her that same night. She tried to twist it around, accusing me of neglecting her needs because I was too consumed by my job. I recall staring at her in disbelief, wondering how she could justify her betrayal by blaming me. It stung, not just because she cheated, but because she pinned the fault on the very work that paid our mortgage and funded her fitness pursuits. Our argument escalated quickly, filled with anger and tears on her part, and a furious silence on mine. I had nothing left to say. She admitted she'd been seeing him for a few months. They hadn't intended to hurt me, she claimed, but they'd felt drawn to each other in ways she couldn't describe. Every word she spoke cut deeper, a reminder of all the times she'd lied to my face. I remember leaving the house that night, driving aimlessly just to calm myself. The car radio was off, and the silence seemed suffocating. My mind raced with thoughts of betrayal, heartbreak, and a strange sense of relief that at least I knew the truth. I pulled over, stared at the steering wheel, and realized I was done being the fool. I spent the next few days sleeping in the guest room. The atmosphere in our house was unbearably tense. She tried to talk to me, offering excuses and half-baked apologies, but I refused to engage. Part of me wanted to lash out, but I knew it wouldn't help. I knew I needed to plan my moves carefully. My pride was wounded, yet I felt a strange determination to keep my emotions in check. It was almost businesslike, the way I weighed my options. She could have the house, the car, everything if she wanted, but I refused to let her walk away without consequences. The final straw was when she told me we could try counseling. She said it as though her affair was a minor slip, something we could patch up with a few sessions. My blood boiled, but I remained calm. I told her I needed space and left for a hotel, determined not to let her break me down further. In that hotel room, staring at a stained carpet, I mapped out the next steps. I listed all the documents I needed, all the legal advice I would seek. She had her trainer. I had my determination. First, I reached out to a divorce lawyer who had been recommended by an old colleague. We scheduled an appointment, and I laid out every incriminating detail. I showed him screenshots of their messages, pictures of them together, and receipts for her gym sessions that I had been financing. He didn't sugarcoat anything. According to him, in our state, infidelity alone wouldn't necessarily grant me a decisive advantage, but the evidence could help during negotiations, especially if I presented it at the right time. I listened to every word carefully, making mental notes about what steps to take. Next, I visited my bank. I wanted to separate our finances as discreetly as possible. I wasn't planning to leave her with nothing, but I refused to let her walk away with more than she deserved. The banker advised me on how to open new accounts and manage any joint assets until the divorce was finalized. Finally, I contacted a friend who worked in real estate. He promised to keep an eye out if I needed a new place. Every action I took felt like a piece of justice. I was no longer the naive husband, and that realization fueled my resolve. Confronting Kara again felt surreal. When I returned home to gather some clothes, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the TV that wasn't even on. She looked worn, her eyes red from crying. She asked me how we'd gone from happy newlyweds to silent strangers. I didn't have an answer for her. There was no point explaining the pain I felt. She already knew. Instead, I told her I'd started the divorce process immediately. Her face went pale and she tried to protest, but I cut her off. I reminded her that she'd made her choices. She argued it was just a mistake, that she'd gotten carried away, but I told her I didn't care about her excuses anymore. I had run out of patience. Watching her crumble didn't bring me the satisfaction I thought it would, but it did confirm that I was doing what was right for me. I wouldn't let her manipulate me into staying. I packed a suitcase and left without another word. As I walked out the door, she begged me to stay, saying she would end it with the trainer. But that was too little, too late. My mind was completely set. I relocated to a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to clear my head and focus on the future. I buried myself in work during the day, and in the evenings, I tackled the endless divorce paperwork. Friends called, offering condolences and support, but I rarely opened up. I felt embarrassed that my marriage had fallen apart so publicly. Rumors spread quickly, and soon enough, I became the topic of workplace whispers and neighborhood gossip. People sympathized, but I didn't want their pity. I wanted resolution. My lawyer and I had started crafting a settlement strategy. Since Kara was employed and had initiated the affair, we hoped to finalize terms that recognized my financial contributions. There were moments when I felt a pang of nostalgia, memories of our wedding, our vacations, our life. But whenever that happened, I forced myself to recall the text messages and the expression on Kara's face when she got caught. Anger replaced the sadness, fueling my determination. I wasn't going to be the man who folded under betrayal. I'd lost faith in our marriage, but I'd found a new sense of self-worth in the process. A few weeks into our separation, I ran into the trainer at a local grocery store. I'd only seen him once before, but his face was seared into my memory. He recognized me too. The second our eyes met, he looked away as though trying to avoid a confrontation. For a split second, I felt a strong urge to grab him by the collar and demand answers, but I held back, reminding myself that my anger was better channeled through legal means. I walked past him without a word, though my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. Later that night, I got a text from Kara saying she'd heard about our encounter and wanted me to stay civil. The nerve of her, I thought. She was the one who destroyed our marriage, yet she had the gall to instruct me on how to behave. That text only served to rekindle my fury. I decided to block her number and communicate exclusively through my lawyer unless it involved something urgent. If she wanted civility, she should have considered that before betraying me. Keeping my composure felt like my final act of control in a world turned upside down. Months passed, and the divorce proceedings dragged on. Kara's lawyer tried to paint me as an inattentive spouse who had prioritized work over our relationship. Meanwhile, my lawyer countered with evidence of her affair and the financial support I'd provided. Neither side was backing down, so we found ourselves in mediation, haggling over every last detail: the house, the savings accounts, even furniture. Kara looked miserable throughout the process, but I refused to allow her sorrow to influence me. She had made a choice, and now she was dealing with the fallout. Despite my anger, I wasn't out to ruin her life. I just wanted what was fair. But fairness, it seemed, was subjective. She argued she deserved alimony because she had taken a break from her career for our marriage. I refused to pay a cent more than necessary. Eventually, we reached a tentative agreement. I'd keep a larger share of the savings, and she'd keep the house. She was free to live there or sell it if she wanted, but I wouldn't be tied to it. As I signed the preliminary documents, I felt a strange sense of closure creeping in. I was finally untangling myself from her. The day the divorce was finalized, I felt an unexpected wave of calm wash over me. It happened in a sterile courthouse with paperwork and obligatory handshakes. Kara looked as if she wanted to say something, but I avoided eye contact and focused on the judge's final words. When it was done, I walked out without glancing back. That evening, I packed away the last remnants of our shared life: wedding photos, old anniversary cards, trinkets from trips we'd taken. I couldn't bring myself to toss them out yet, but I couldn't keep them around either, so I stuffed everything into a storage box and slid it under my bed. Friends wanted to take me out to celebrate. I wasn't in a festive mood, but I agreed, hoping that being around people would help. The bar was dimly lit, and the music was a dull throb in the background. My buddies raised their glasses and cheered to my new beginning. I forced a smile and took a sip, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow. I realized then that freedom can feel lonely. Yet, beneath that loneliness lay something else. The sweet taste of finally standing up for myself fully. In the weeks that followed, I started to rebuild. I refocused on my business, putting in the same energy that had once annoyed Kara. Only now, that energy had a clearer purpose. I took on new clients, expanded my network, and found renewed motivation in every project. My personal life remained quiet. I wasn't ready to date again, and truth be told, I enjoyed the solitude. No more constant arguments, no more suspicion. My phone was quiet except for work calls and the occasional message from friends. On weekends, I visited my parents or went for long drives to clear my mind. I discovered parts of myself I'd neglected during the marriage. I signed up for online courses to sharpen my skills and started hitting the gym, ironically. The first time I stepped onto a treadmill, I felt a hint of bitterness, but I pushed through. This wasn't about Kara anymore. It was about me taking care of myself. The progress was gradual, and there were days I still felt hurt or angry, but each morning I woke up a little stronger. The sense of betrayal lingered, but it no longer controlled me. I refused to let her define me. My first act of real revenge came unexpectedly. I received an email from a prospective client who happened to be the head of a new gym franchise in our area. They were looking for a consultant to streamline their expansion plans. When I researched the company, I discovered that Kara's trainer had recently started working there. The opportunity was too perfect to pass up. During negotiations, I made sure my role would include evaluating their staff's performance and handling internal issues. Once I secured the contract, I approached it with utmost professionalism. I never mentioned Kara or the trainer initially, focusing instead on delivering results. Over several weeks, I identified inefficiencies in the gym's operations and proposed solutions that impressed the executives. I gained their trust, which meant they listened closely to my recommendations regarding staffing. When I finally met with the manager and was asked about the trainer's performance, I presented factual, objective observations. He wasn't as skilled or as committed as the job demanded. I highlighted customer complaints and documented his lateness. It wasn't personal on paper, but my motive was clear. Soon after, the trainer was let go. I felt a sense of justified triumph and relief. Kara found out soon enough. She texted me from a new number, accusing me of ruining the trainer's career. She called me petty, vengeful, and heartless. I responded with a single sentence: actions have consequences. Then I blocked her again. I wasn't proud of stooping to her level, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction it brought. This wasn't about forgiveness or redemption. It was about taking back the power she had stolen from me. Some might say I went too far. Others would argue I was simply leveling the playing field. Either way, I didn't lose sleep over it. If anything, it gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since discovering her affair. Around the same time, I wrapped up the project with the gym franchise on a high note. The executives praised my work, and my reputation as a consultant grew. I secured more clients, and my business thrived. In that sense, my personal vendetta aligned with my professional goals. Every milestone felt like another nail in the coffin of my old life. I was moving forward unapologetically, and for the first time in a long while, I felt content with the direction my life had taken. One late evening, nearly a year after the divorce, I stumbled upon an old photo of Kara and me. We were laughing, holding each other close in a moment that felt genuine. For a brief second, I was overwhelmed by memories, both good and bad. Everything that happened still hurt, but I also felt an odd sense of gratitude for how much I'd grown. Betrayal has a way of teaching brutal lessons. I had learned to be more cautious, less trusting, but I had also discovered my resilience. The phone vibrated, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a friend inviting me to a small get-together. I hesitated, then accepted. I realized I was no longer defined by what Kara had done. That chapter was over, and while the scars remained, they no longer bled. I'd taken my revenge, and I'd found closure on my own terms. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and headed out with a lighter heart than I'd had in years. As I locked my apartment door, I took one last look at that photo. Then I slipped it into a drawer, deciding that some memories, even painful ones, were worth keeping. I left quietly afterward. Life didn't magically become perfect after all was said and done. Sometimes I'd wake up to a twinge of regret or an echo of anger, but it became smaller with each passing day. I'd gone through hell, but I'd emerged with a stronger sense of who I was. I hadn't forgiven Kara, and I never planned to. In my mind, forgiveness was for those who deserved it, and she had proven otherwise. The scars she left behind served as a reminder never to let anyone take advantage of my loyalty again. Still, I learned not to let that bitterness consume me. My happiness mattered more than holding on to rage. I could move forward without forgiving her. That alone felt like victory. Whenever people asked how I was doing, I'd say I was fine, and I meant it. I surrounded myself with genuine friends and focused on my aspirations. The next time I got into a relationship, I'd tread more carefully. Yet, I wouldn't let my past dictate my future. I'd found my self-respect, and no betrayal could ever take it away. This was the new me, unbroken, unapologetic, and ready for whatever came next. And for the first time, I lived. I never expected my own family to betray me over money, but that's exactly what happened last year. My brother Alex and I grew up close, or so I thought. We attended the same schools, played the same sports, and even shared some of the same friends. I always assumed we had each other's backs. My parents used to brag about how well we got along, saying things like, "You two are so lucky to have each other." But I guess you never truly know a person until you mix money into the equation. That's where everything fell apart, completely. I worked hard throughout college, balancing 2 part-time jobs while studying. After graduation, I landed an entry-level position in marketing, which didn't pay much at first, but I kept grinding. Over the years, I rose through the ranks. My boss recognized my dedication, so he promoted me a few times. By the time I was 30, I had saved a decent sum of money. I always believed in living below my means, investing wisely, and preparing for the future. That's how I managed to accumulate around $50,000 in a savings account. I was incredibly proud of that achievement. I wasn't planning to flaunt my savings, but one evening during a casual family dinner, my mother asked if I had any plans for a new car or a house. She knew I was a cautious spender, but she also knew I'd been doing well. I admitted I had around $50,000 saved up, and her eyes lit up. My dad chimed in with a congratulations, and Alex just nodded. Later that night, Alex pulled me aside. He spoke in hushed tones about a business venture he wanted to start, asking if I could invest in his bright new idea. To be honest, I wasn't immediately dismissive. I love my brother, and I wanted to help him succeed, so I listened to his pitch. He talked about launching a small online retail store that specialized in fitness supplements. He seemed knowledgeable, and his plan sounded plausible enough that I considered it. But I'm nobody's fool. I told him I'd need to see a proper business proposal, financial projections, and all the standard details before handing over any money. He agreed and promised to get everything together soon. At that point, I still believed we were on the same side completely. Several weeks passed, and each time I asked Alex about his progress, he gave me vague answers. He'd say things like, "I'm working on it," or "I just need more time to finalize a few numbers." I started getting suspicious. Whenever I tried to set up a meeting to discuss the proposal, he'd suddenly be busy. At family dinners, he'd wave off the topic, saying, "Let's talk later." Meanwhile, I was discovering little hints that he'd been hanging around casinos with some of his friends. My parents never questioned him. They acted as though everything was perfectly normal. Somehow strange. One night, I got a text from Alex asking if I could meet him at a nearby bar. He said he wanted to show me something important. I assumed he'd finally finished his business plan. Instead, I found him slurring his words about how he owed some people money. I asked him outright if he had been gambling. He tried to deny it, but then confessed he'd lost a few thousand at the casino. When I pressed him on how he got the cash, he mumbled something about borrowing it. That set off alarms in my head. I was livid. I confronted him right there, asking if he was trying to scam me with that so-called business idea. He shook his head and begged me to believe he had a real plan, but got sidetracked by bad influences. I reminded him I wasn't about to toss my life savings into a gamble, literally or figuratively. He asked if I could lend him just a bit of money to get out of his current hole, promising he'd pay me back once he squared away his debts and launched his business. Realistically, though, I told him I needed to think about it. The next day, I tried to talk to my parents about the situation. I explained that Alex might have a gambling problem and that he'd asked me for money. My dad looked concerned, but my mom immediately jumped to Alex's defense, insisting he was just going through a rough patch. She said, "He's your brother. You should be helping him, not accusing him of things." Dad added that family should support each other. I told them I was all for support, but not if I was being deceived. They shrugged it off, as though I was overreacting or imagining issues. I decided not to give Alex any money until I saw real evidence that he wasn't just gambling it all away. Over the next few weeks, I stayed busy with my job, trying not to let this drama consume me. Then one afternoon, I logged into my bank account to transfer some funds, and I froze. $50,000 was gone. At first, I thought it was a glitch, but after checking the transaction history, I saw that the entire sum had been transferred out just 2 days before. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I was livid. I immediately called the bank. They confirmed the transfer was made using my online credentials. I didn't remember authorizing any such transaction, so I asked how it could happen. The representative said the login came from my IP address. That's when I realized Alex must have used my computer or found my password somehow. I'd let him house sit once or twice, and sometimes we used the same laptop. Furious, I called Alex, but he didn't pick up. I drove straight to my parents' house where he was staying. He was nowhere to be found, and nobody knew where he went. After hours of searching, calling his friends, and leaving voicemails, I finally got a text from him around midnight. It said, "I'm so sorry, I'll fix this. Don't call the cops." I nearly threw my phone across the room. He'd stolen all my savings and had the nerve to tell me not to involve law enforcement. The next morning, I went to my parents and told them I was going to file a police report. My mother started sobbing, saying that would ruin Alex's life. My dad said, "Don't you think we can handle this privately as a family?" Seriously, I glared at them in disbelief. Alex had committed a literal crime, and they were concerned about his life being ruined? What about my life savings, my future? But they insisted we all sit down and talk it through first. I waited an entire day before Alex showed up, looking disheveled and exhausted. He admitted he'd taken the money to try and gamble his way out of the debts he already had. Of course, he lost it all, $50,000 gone in a matter of hours. He pleaded for my forgiveness, saying he never meant to hurt me. Unbelievable. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. He expected me to just say, "It's okay, we're brothers, so no worries." I told him in no uncertain terms that I wasn't going to forgive him and that I wanted my money back, no matter what it took. My mother gasped, and my father shook his head. They started lecturing me about compassion and how Alex was in a dark place. I shot back that I was officially broke because of him. Didn't that matter? Then my mother said something I'll never forget. "You don't deserve that money if you're so heartless." Unreal. I felt something snap inside me. All those years of trying to be responsible, saving bit by bit, sacrificing luxuries, and this was their reaction? I walked out of the house, got into my car, and drove away, ignoring their calls and texts. Over the next few days, I was consumed by rage. I thought about going to the police, but part of me wondered if that would really get me anywhere. Alex had already blown the money. Even if he ended up in jail, I'd still be left with nothing. So I decided to approach it differently. I seethed. I needed proof of what happened, and I needed a plan to make sure Alex and my parents understood the magnitude of what they'd done. First, I hired a lawyer. She explained that while I could file charges, the likelihood of recovering the money was low unless Alex had assets. He didn't. But she also suggested I gather all the evidence I could, bank statements, text messages, any communications admitting guilt. That way, if Alex ever came into money or assets, I could file a civil suit. I agreed and started documenting every detail of his theft and my family's reaction. Next, I started contacting some people Alex owed money to. I discovered he had borrowed from friends, co-workers, and even a local loan shark. Everyone was angry, but no one had taken formal action yet. Some had threatened him, but that only caused him to hide. I decided to let them know exactly what Alex had done to me. I also hinted that if they wanted to coordinate efforts to recoup anything, I'd be willing to share information. This wasn't out of pure spite, although I was truly furious. I felt they should know the full extent of Alex's deceit. My parents tried to intervene when they found out I was talking to Alex's creditors. They claimed I was endangering him, that these were not good people to upset. I retorted that maybe they should have thought about that before defending him unconditionally. My mother's tears no longer moved me. My father's disappointment barely registered. They had made their choice. They wanted me to be the sacrificial lamb to preserve the illusion of a harmonious family. Meanwhile, Alex was running around, dodging responsibility for his gambling addiction. I refused to let them push me aside for his sake any longer. Never. Eventually, Alex realized his entire safety net was gone. Our parents were still somewhat supportive, but they didn't have large sums of money to bail him out. His friends had turned their backs on him, and the loan shark was reportedly sending him threatening messages. He came knocking on my apartment door one night, pleading for a chance to make things right. He offered to repay me by giving me shares in a new venture he was cooking up with some acquaintance. I laughed in his face. Shares? From the same guy who had stolen every penny I had saved? I told him to leave and never show his face again unless he had cold cash. He started crying, saying he was at rock bottom and needed my help. I reminded him that I'd tried to help before, but he'd used me as a personal bank. He then accused me of being heartless, just like our mother had. That was the final straw. I screamed at him to get out, and this time he did, stumbling down the hallway, tears streaming. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly replaced by the memory of my empty bank account. Days later, I heard from one of his old friends that Alex had been beaten up by the loan shark's goons. Apparently, they wanted their money, and he had nothing to give. My parents called, begging me to help him. I refused. I told them they could sell their possessions if they were so concerned, but I wasn't handing over another dime. They called me cruel, said I was abandoning my own brother in his worst moment. I reminded them that he'd abandoned me first, stealing everything I had. They fell silent, then my mother just sobbed and hung up. I was no longer interested in being the family scapegoat. I decided to cut ties. I blocked their numbers and changed my locks, even moved to a new place. The stress was taking a toll on my health, so I started seeing a therapist. She helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for fixing Alex's life, and that my parents were enabling his behavior. Slowly, I came to terms with the fact that my savings were gone, but I refused to stay stuck in anger and self-pity. I channeled my frustration into my work, pushing harder for promotions and raises. Months passed. I was earning more and had rebuilt some of my financial cushion. Occasionally, I'd get voicemails from my parents or messages from Alex, but I ignored them all. I didn't care if they considered me cold. The day Alex stole my money was the day he lost my loyalty. Then, out of the blue, I got a call from a distant relative. Apparently, my great-aunt had passed away and left me a modest inheritance. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough that my parents took notice. Suddenly, they wanted to reconcile and be a family again. They tried to arrange a meeting at the same old house where everything had gone down. I agreed, curiosity. When I arrived, they were all waiting for me in the living room, my mother, father, and Alex, who looked gaunt and nervous. My dad started with small talk, asking about my job, but I cut him off. I said, "Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want?" My mother stared at Alex, then back at me. She began talking about how people make mistakes, how family is forever, and how they hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive. I held up my hand to stop her. I told them I wasn't here for a reunion. I was there to hear what they wanted. My father finally admitted they hoped I could loan Alex some money to pay off lingering debts and maybe help him start over. I almost burst out laughing. After everything that happened, they still wanted me to bankroll him? I asked if they were delusional or just oblivious. My mother looked at me with watery eyes and Alex stared at the floor. Nobody had an answer. I guess they expected me to just comply. Seriously. Then I pulled out a folder with copies of every document I had, statements showing the unauthorized bank transfer, texts where Alex admitted he stole my money, and notes from our lawyer discussions. I spread them across the coffee table. I explained that I was fully prepared to press charges at any moment, and that I could also file a civil lawsuit to garnish Alex's future earnings if he ever made anything of himself. My parents looked horrified, and Alex went pale. I told them I wasn't bluffing. If they ever contacted me again for money, I would proceed. Immediately. Silence filled the room. My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. My father just leaned back, closing his eyes. Alex started shaking. Finally, he asked if there was any chance we could be brothers again. I said, "Not after what you did. You took my trust, my savings, and you threw them away. Don't ever expect forgiveness from me." With that, I picked up my documents and walked toward the door. I paused and told them that if they wanted to fix anything, they'd better start by getting Alex into a serious gambling recovery program. I insisted. I left without looking back. In the following weeks, I focused on myself. I used my small inheritance to pay off some lingering bills and put the rest in investments. I continued working hard, and within a year, I'd managed to buy a modest condo. I felt a sense of pride that, despite everything, I was rebuilding my life. As for Alex, I heard bits and pieces through acquaintances. Apparently, he tried rehab a couple of times, but kept relapsing. My parents tried to help him financially again, and it drained their retirement savings. That wasn't my problem anymore. Ever. Then, one afternoon, I got a certified letter from a law firm. At first, I panicked, thinking Alex was trying some legal stunt. But it turned out it was my parents who were suing me, claiming I owed them money for unfairly distancing myself from family obligations. I nearly choked reading that. They were arguing that I had a moral duty to support Alex and that by refusing, I'd caused him emotional distress. My lawyer laughed when she saw it, calling it frivolous. She filed a response immediately, and within weeks, the suit was dismissed. It was a desperate move. That was the final nail in the coffin. I cut them all off permanently. I changed my phone number again, blocked them on social media, and even told mutual friends I didn't want updates. Life became calmer. I channeled my energy into my career, friendships, and personal goals. I took trips, learned new skills, and felt freer than I had in years. Sometimes I'd get a pang of regret or nostalgia for the days when I believed we were a tight-knit family. But then I'd remember how quickly they sided with Alex after he stole from me. That was enough. Yesterday, I got an unexpected message from a mutual friend saying Alex had apparently hit the jackpot at some casino, won a six-figure sum. For a moment, I imagined he might come crawling back, offering to repay what he stole. Then I heard he immediately vanished on a trip to Europe, blowing through the winnings with zero intention of restitution. And you know what? I'm not even mad. I've moved on, rebuilt my savings, and carved out a life without them. If he wants to self-destruct, that's his choice. I no longer feel any obligation. My self-respect is still completely intact.